Rebecca Calloway stepped off the bus at Parris Island in June 1997 with a black belt hidden under her regulation uniform and a chip on her shoulder the size of Texas. The scorching South Carolina sun beat down on the young woman's face as she surveyed the imposing military compound that would be her home for the next 12 weeks. No one knew that in just 28 seconds, this 5'4" woman would forever change how the United States Marine Corps viewed female recruits. A story of gender-biased true strength and how the Marines were forced to evolve. Comment below if you've ever witnessed a similar situation and stay until the end to discover the shocking secret about Rebecca's father and the buried operation in Iraq that would shake the military establishment to its core. The military transport bus rolled to a stop, its brakes hissing like a warning. Rebecca Calloway lifted her head from the window where she'd been watching the marshlands of coastal South Carolina slide by. Unlike the other recruits who had spent the 3-hour ride from Charleston fidgeting nervously or dozing from exhaustion, Rebecca had remained perfectly still, her posture military straight, her eyes constantly observing. "Welcome to hell," muttered the lanky boy next to her, a farm kid from Nebraska whose Adam's apple bobbed like a buoy as he swallowed hard. Rebecca didn't reply. She simply gathered her small duffel bag from beneath the seat, her movements economical and precise. Nothing about her, from her modest height to her athletic but unremarkable build, suggested she was anything other than what she appeared, a 24-year-old woman attempting to prove herself in a man's world. Nothing, that is, except for her eyes. Steel gray like her father's, they moved with the careful assessment of a predator cataloging potential threats. "Off the bus! Move it, move it, move it!" The drill instructor's voice cracked through the humid air like artillery fire. Recruits stumbled over each other in their haste to comply, faces already slick with sweat and fear. Rebecca waited until the initial crush subsided, then rose smoothly to her feet. She stepped onto the tarmac of Parris Island Recruit Depot, one of only 5 women in a bus full of men. She could feel the stares immediately, some curious, others dismissive, a few openly hostile. A memory flashed before her eyes. She was 7 years old again, standing in the converted barn behind their Montana ranch house. Her father, Colonel William Wild Bill Calloway, circled her slowly, his combat boots leaving precise impressions in the sawdust that covered the floor. "The world will never see you coming, Becky," he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes and the desert sand of Operation Desert Storm. "They'll look at you and see a little girl. That's your advantage. Never give it away until the moment is right." Even at 7, she understood what he meant. That day was the beginning of her education, not just in martial arts, but in strategy, in patience, in the art of appearing less than you are. Female recruits fall in separately. The drill instructor's voice pulled her back to the present. As she moved to join the other women, Rebecca caught the sneer on a nearby male recruit's face. "This should be fun to watch," he said to his buddy, loud enough for her to hear. "Wonder how long before they start crying." Rebecca kept her face expressionless as she fell into line with the other women. None of them looked at each other, each already isolated in her own private crucible. What none of them knew, what no one at Parris Island knew, was that Rebecca Calloway hadn't come to the Marines simply to prove herself. She'd come for answers. 6 years ago, her father had disappeared during a classified mission in post-Gulf War Iraq. The official story was that Colonel William Calloway had died heroically saving his men from an ambush. But the man who'd returned her father's personal effects had avoided meeting her eyes, and the folded flag they'd presented at the empty casket funeral had felt like a prop in a poorly staged play. As Rebecca stood at rigid attention, feeling the drill instructor's breath on her face as he screamed standard intimidation at the female recruits, her mind was calculating. Somewhere on this base were people who knew the truth about Operation Mirage, her father's final mission. Somewhere here were answers about why Wild Bill Calloway, a decorated Delta Force operator who'd survived 3 wars and countless classified operations, had suddenly vanished from the face of the earth. "I'm coming for you, Dad," she thought, as sweat trickled down her back. "One way or another, I'm going to find out what really happened." The first week at Parris Island was designed to break civilians down to nothing before rebuilding them as Marines. For the women of Echo Company, the process came with an extra layer of scrutiny and skepticism. The Marine Corps had been the last holdout against gender integration, and even now, with official barriers falling, the culture remained deeply resistant. Rebecca moved through the prescribed hell with mechanical precision. She ran when ordered to run, did push-ups until her arms trembled, and endured the constant barrage of insults without reaction. She kept herself firmly in the middle of the pack, never the fastest, never the slowest, never drawing attention. On the seventh day, as the female recruits filed into the mess hall for their strictly timed meal, Rebecca noticed a group of male drill instructors gathered at a corner table. Their eyes followed the women with undisguised contempt. One man in particular seemed to be studying them with special intensity, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant with a square jaw and cold blue eyes. "That's Staff Sergeant Blackwood," whispered Carol Matthews, a wiry woman from Philadelphia who had taken the bunk next to Rebecca's. "I heard he used to play football for Notre Dame before joining up. They say he's got a special hatred for the female integration program." Rebecca nodded but said nothing as she accepted her tray of institutional food. She'd already marked Blackwood had noticed how the other drill instructors deferred to him despite his relatively young age. There was something in his bearing that spoke of absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his place in the world's hierarchy. As she sat down at the designated table, Rebecca felt Blackwood's eyes on her. She did not look up, but every muscle in her body tensed instinctively. Later that evening, as the female recruits performed maintenance on their rifles under the watchful eye of their assigned drill instructor, Sergeant Hamilton Rebecca caught snippets of a conversation from just outside the barracks door. "It's a joke, sir. These women have no place here." Blackwood's voice carried easily through the humid evening air. "The standards are being lowered across the board." "Orders are orders, Blackwood." The second voice belonged to an older man. "The integration is happening, whether we like it or not. It's going to get people killed in the field. My men, they're not your men anymore, Staff Sergeant. You're an instructor now. Do your job." There was a pause, and Rebecca could almost feel a Blackwood's resentment radiating through the walls. "Yes, sir, but with respect, sir, if any of these women make it through to combat roles, it won't be on my watch. I'll see to that personally." That night, as the other recruits fell into exhausted sleep, Rebecca lay awake on her hard bunk, her mind turning over what she'd heard. Blackwood was going to be a problem, not just for the female integration program, but for her personal mission as well. Men like him controlled access, controlled information. If she needed to find records about Operation Mirage, she would need allies, not enemies. A memory surfaced, her father sitting on the porch of their ranch, cleaning his service pistol with methodical precision. "The most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who hate you, Becky," he'd said. "They're the ones who fear you, because fear makes men stupid, makes them reckless. Remember that." Rebecca closed her eyes and began the breathing exercises her father had taught her. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. By the second week, patterns had emerged. Staff Sergeant Blackwood had gathered a small coterie of like-minded instructors, men who shared his views on female integration and weren't shy about making their opinions known. Sergeant Mitchell was the youngest, a former collegiate wrestler with quick movements and quicker temper. Sergeant Ramirez was built like a bull with massive shoulders and a perpetual scowl. Corporal Cooper carried himself with the cocky swagger of a man who'd never met a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer determination. And Sergeant Sullivan, the quietest of the group, had the calculating eyes of someone who preferred to let others do the talking while he observed and waited. They'd taken to appearing whenever the female recruits had physical training, standing on the sidelines with crossed arms and mocking smiles. Their presence was not technically a violation of any regulation, but the message was clear. You are being judged, and you are being found wanting. The women of Echo Company reacted in different ways. Two had already dropped out, unable to handle the combined pressure of the rigorous training and the hostile scrutiny. Carol Matthews had developed a brittle defiance, performing each task with grim determination and flashing anger. The remaining recruit, a former college athlete named Diaz, had adopted a strategy of perfect technical compliance while avoiding any interaction that wasn't absolutely necessary. Rebecca maintained her middle-of-the-pack performance, but she was watching and learning. She noted how Mitchell shifted his weight before moving, telegraphing his intentions. She saw how Ramirez favored his left side, suggesting an old injury to his right hip or leg. Cooper was right-hand dominant to a fault, and Sullivan was the most interesting of all. He watched the female recruits not with contempt, but with clinical assessment, as if they were specimens in a laboratory experiment. On Thursday of the second week during the obstacle course training, the first direct confrontation occurred. Rebecca was midway through the course, navigating a series of walls and rope climbs when she heard a commotion ahead. Carol Matthews had fallen from one of the higher obstacles and was lying on the ground clutching her ankle. Sergeant Mitchell stood over her, his face a mask of disgust. "Get up, recruit," he barked. "You think the enemy is going to wait while you cry about a little sprain?" Carol struggled to her feet, her face white with pain, but as she put weight on her injured ankle, she crumpled again. Mitchell's expression darkened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said loud enough for all nearby recruits to hear. "This is what happens when we prioritize political correctness over combat readiness." Rebecca, who had paused at the previous obstacle, assessed the situation in an instant. Carol's injury was genuine. She could see the already swelling ankle from where she stood. Mitchell was using the moment to make a point to reinforce the narrative that women were too fragile for the Corps, and none of the other recruits, male or female, were going to intervene. Decision time. Rebecca moved forward, her pace unhurried but deliberate. As she approached, Mitchell turned his attention to her. "Keep moving, Calloway. This isn't your concern." Rebecca stopped precisely 3 feet from him, close enough to engage but far enough to react if necessary. "Sir, permission to assist Recruit Matthews to medical, sir?" Her voice was regulation perfect, revealing nothing. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Denied. Matthews can make it on her own or she can drop out. Those are the options." "Sir, a Marine never leaves another Marine behind, sir." Rebecca kept her eyes forward, not meeting Mitchell's gaze directly, a calculated show of deference while making a point that couldn't be refuted without contradicting core values. For a moment, tension crackled between them like summer lightning. Then a new voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the problem here?" Staff Sergeant Blackwood approached from the direction of the instructor's station. His movements unhurried, almost casual. "Recruit Matthews has injured her ankle, sir," Mitchell reported. "Recruit Calloway seems to think this requires special accommodation." Blackwood studied Rebecca with those cold blue eyes, and for a heartbeat, something like recognition flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same contemptuous mask he always wore. "Is that right, Calloway? You think Marines get special treatment when they're hurt in the field?" "No, sir," Rebecca replied. "I think Marines support their fellow Marines so the mission can continue, sir." It was a fine line to walk respectful but not submissive, making her point without direct challenge. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing. "Mitchell, get Matthews to medical. We need her patched up and back in training ASAP. Can't have anyone saying we don't give every recruit a fair chance." His tone made it clear what he thought of fair chances. But his order was technically by the book. As Mitchell reluctantly helped Carol to her feet, Blackwood turned his full attention to Rebecca. "Finish the course, Calloway, and remember out there in the real world, good intentions don't stop bullets. Only strength and readiness do. And from what I've seen so far, you're short on both." Rebecca maintained perfect composure as she replied, "Yes, sir, I'll remember that, sir." But as she turned to continue the obstacle course, she caught something unexpected in Blackwood's expression, not just the standard instructor's hostility, but something more personal, something almost like concern. That evening, as Rebecca methodically cleaned her rifle, she replayed the encounter in her mind. Blackwood had reacted to her in a way that was different from his general contempt for the female recruits. For just a moment when he'd first looked at her, there had been recognition, which meant one of two things: either he knew who her father was, or he had reviewed her file specifically. Either way, she had inadvertently drawn attention, the very thing her father had warned against. "Everything is need to know until the moment of action," he'd told her during one of their training sessions in the converted barn. "The second you show your hand, you lose the advantage of surprise." Rebecca reassembled her rifle with practiced efficiency, her mind racing through contingency plans. If Blackwood knew who she was, knew she was Wild Bill Calloway's daughter, her mission had just become significantly more complicated. As she finished with her rifle, Carol Matthews limped into the barracks, her ankle wrapped in a supportive bandage. "Thanks for standing up for me out there," Carol said quietly as she sank onto her bunk. "Most people wouldn't have done that." Rebecca shrugged. "Marines take care of their own." "Is that why you joined, to be part of something bigger?" Rebecca was silent for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. "My father was military," she said finally. "Delta Force. I guess it's in the blood." Delta Force. Wow. Carol's eyes widen. That's the real deal. Is he still in? He died in Iraq after Desert Storm. The lie came easily after 6 years of practice. Or at least that's what they tell me. Carol's expression shifted to sympathy. I'm sorry, my dad served 2 regular Marines, nothing special. But he always said the Corps was the best thing that ever happened to him. That's why I'm here, I guess, trying to understand him better. Rebecca nodded, her attention split between the conversation and the subtle movements of the other recruits in the barracks. Most were engaged in their own tasks, but she noticed Diaz glancing their way with unusual frequency. What about you, Carol pressed? Why the Marines specifically? With your background, you could have gone officer track or even special forces eventually. I have my reasons, Rebecca said, deliberately vague. Then to deflect further questions, she added, how's the ankle? Doc says it's just a bad sprain. I'll be back on the course by Monday. Carol lowered her voice. But between you and me, I think Mitchell was hoping I'd wash out. He had this look when I went down, like he was satisfied. Probably, Rebecca agreed, but that just means you have to prove him wrong. Easy for you to say. You moved through those obstacles like you were born on them. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. Practice, lots of practice. What she didn't say was that the obstacle course at Parris Island was child's play compared to what her father had built on their Montana property. By age 12, she'd been running courses designed to challenge Delta Force operators, often in the snow, sometimes at night. Physical barriers had long ago ceased to intimidate her. Human barriers, though, those were trickier. And as she prepared for lights out, Rebecca caught Blackwood's name in a whispered conversation between 2 recruits several bunks away. Heard Blackwood was in Iraq during the cleanup. Saw some serious action. Yeah, but he never talks about it. My brother was in the same unit, said there was some operation that went bad. Real bad. Blackwood was one of the only survivors. Rebecca stilled her senses, suddenly razor sharp, but the conversation shifted to more mundane complaints about the day's training. Still, she filed the information away. Iraq, cleanup operations. A mission that went real bad. It wasn't much, but it was a thread that might lead to the tapestry of truth she was seeking. As the lights went out and the barracks settled into the sounds of exhausted sleep, Rebecca lay awake staring at the ceiling. Somewhere on this base was the information about Operation Mirage. Somewhere here were people who knew what had really happened to her father. And now, with Blackwood's special attention, the clock was ticking. She would need to accelerate her plans. In the darkness, Rebecca's hand moved to the small locket she wore beneath her regulation t-shirt, the only personal item she'd brought with her. Inside was a faded photograph of her father in his dress uniform, his face stern, but his eyes crinkling at the corners with hidden humor. On the back, written in his precise handwriting, "Strength isn't about force, it's about knowing when to use it." "I'm getting closer, Dad," she whispered silently. "And when I find out what really happened, they'll pay, every last one of them." The Montana skies stretched endlessly blue above the Callaway Ranch, a vast canvas interrupted only by the distant peaks of the Bridger Mountains. Rebecca, 13 years old and already whipcord strong, circled her father cautiously on the sawdust floor of the converted barn. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead despite the cool autumn air. "You're telegraphing," Colonel William Callaway said, his voice matter-of-fact rather than critical. "Your right shoulder drops before you move. In a real fight, that's all the warning your opponent needs." Rebecca nodded, adjusting her stance. Her father was not a large man, compact and wiry rather than imposing, but he moved with the fluid economy of someone who had turned his body into a precision instrument. At 45, with silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, he could still outmaneuver men half his age. "Again, Mom," he said, raising his hands into a defensive position. Rebecca attacked a flurry of strikes and feints that would have overwhelmed most grown men. Her father deflected each one with minimal movement, his expression unchanging. Then, in a move too fast for her to track, he swept her feet from under her. Rebecca hit the ground with a thud that drove the air from her lungs. "Better," he said, extending a hand to help her up. "But you're still thinking linearly. Combat isn't chess. It's jazz. You have to improvise." As she regained her feet, Rebecca caught sight of her mother watching from the barn doorway. Eleanor Callaway's face was a study in conflicted emotions, pride and worry battling for dominance. She never objected to these training sessions, but she never fully approved either. "That's enough for today," her father said, noticing his wife's presence. "Go help your mother with dinner." Rebecca nodded, gathering her gear with the same precision she'd been taught to apply to all tasks. As she passed her mother in the doorway, Eleanor brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead with gentle fingers. "He pushes you so hard," she murmured. "I want him too," Rebecca replied, with the absolute certainty of youth. "I'm going to be just like him someday." Later that evening, after Eleanor had gone up to bed, Rebecca found her father in his study, cleaning his service pistol, while a glass of bourbon sat untouched on the desk beside him. The walls were lined with bookshelves, military history tactical manuals, and philosophy texts arranged with military precision. The only decoration was a shadow box containing his numerous commendations and medals, including the Silver Star he'd earned during the Gulf War. "Dad," Rebecca lingered in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, his hands never pausing in their practiced movements. "Of course. Why are you training me like this? None of my friends' dads teach them how to fight, or how to survive in the wilderness, or how to read people." William Calloway was silent for a long moment, his fingers reassembling the pistol with unconscious skill. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Come here, Becky." She crossed the room and sat in the leather chair across from his desk. Her father finished with the pistol, set it aside, and gave her his full attention. "The world is not kind to those who are unprepared," he said. "I've seen what happens to people who can't defend themselves, who don't understand the threats around them." His eyes took on the distant look they sometimes got when he was remembering things he never spoke about. "I won't always be here to protect you, so I'm teaching you to protect yourself." "But why all of it? The languages, the survival skills, the fighting?" "Because knowledge is armor, Becky. Every skill you master is a weapon in your arsenal, a tool that can't be taken from you." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "The world will underestimate you because you're female, because you're small. Let them. That's your advantage. But never ever underestimate yourself." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Is that why you make the training so hard? Because the real world is harder?" A rare smile crossed her father's face. "Exactly. I push you here so you won't break out there." He picked up the bourbon and took a small sip. "There's something else you should understand. The strongest people aren't the ones who never feel fear or doubt. They're the ones who feel it and act anyway." "Like you," the smile faded. "I've made mistakes, Becky. Choices I regret. That's part of life too, learning to live with the consequences of your actions." "What kind of mistakes?" Her father was silent for so long that Rebecca thought he wouldn't answer. Then, setting down his glass, he said, "I've followed orders I shouldn't have, and I've refused orders I should have followed. The trick is knowing the difference." His eyes refocused on her. "That's why we read philosophy as well as tactics, because sometimes the hardest battles are fought in here." He tapped his temple. "Knowing what's right when everyone around you is saying it's wrong." Rebecca absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "Is that why some of the other officers don't like you? Because you don't always follow orders?" A sharp laugh escaped him. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Let's just say I've made my share of enemies by speaking uncomfortable truths." He studied her for a moment. "That's another lesson, Becky. Standing up for what's right doesn't make you popular. Sometimes it makes you very, very alone." 5 years later, as Rebecca stood beside her father's empty casket, those words came back to her with painful clarity. The funeral had been small. A few of her father's old comrades, her mother leaning heavily on her arm, and a handful of officials whose discomfort was palpable. The man who presented her with the folded flag of Major Harrison, with carefully blank eyes, had spoken the traditional words about gratitude and sacrifice. But when Rebecca asked him directly what had happened, how her father had died, his answer had been a study in evasion. "A classified operation, Ms. Calloway. Colonel Calloway died saving his men. That's all I can tell you." But his eyes had slid away from hers as he spoke, and Rebecca, trained from childhood to read people's tells, had known instantly he was lying. Now, as she lay in her bunk at Paris Island, those memories sharpened her resolve. Her father had made enemies by standing up for what was right. Had those enemies arranged his death? Was Blackwood one of them? Or was he a witness who could lead her to the truth? Tomorrow she would begin actively searching for information. The time for passive observation was over. The third week at Paris Island brought new challenges as the recruits moved deeper into combat training. For the women of Echo Company, it also brought escalated scrutiny. Staff Sergeant Blackwood and his cohorts had taken to appearing at every training evolution, their presence a constant reminder of the skepticism facing female integration. Rebecca maintained her strategy of capable but unremarkable performance. She completed each task efficiently, but never exceptionally careful not to draw additional attention. But as the training intensified, this balance became increasingly difficult to maintain. During hand-to-hand combat instruction, the female recruits were paired with each other rather than with the male recruits, ostensibly for safety reasons. But the message was clear: women were assumed to be unable to handle full contact training with men. Rebecca found herself paired with Carol Matthews, whose ankle had healed enough for limited duty. As they practiced the basic moves demonstrated by the combat instructor, Rebecca deliberately held back, using only a fraction of her actual skill. "You're pulling your strikes," Carol muttered as they reset for another drill. "Don't worry about my ankle, I can take it." "Just following the demonstration," Rebecca replied quietly. But the truth was more complicated. Years of training with her father had ingrained moves and counter-moves that went far beyond the basic techniques being taught. Muscle memory threatened to betray her every time she entered a fighting stance. From the corner of the training area, she could feel Blackwood's eyes on her. Unlike the other instructors who made their contempt obvious, Blackwood's scrutiny had become more measured, more analytical. He watched her specifically, not the female recruits as a group. After the training session, as the recruits filed out to their next activity, Rebecca deliberately lagged behind, adjusting her gear slowly while keeping Blackwood in her peripheral vision. When he moved to speak with Sergeant Mitchell in low tones, she shifted position to bring herself within earshot. "Still think there's something familiar about her," Blackwood was saying. "Run a deeper check on her background." "Already did," Mitchell replied. "Nothing unusual. Father was military deceased. Mother still lives in Montana. No criminal record, no political activities, nothing that raises flags." "What unit was her father in?" "Army, Delta Force. Died in Iraq after Desert Storm." There was a long pause, and Rebecca forced herself to keep her movements casual as she continued gathering her gear. "Delta," Blackwood repeated, his voice suddenly flat. "What was his name?" "Calloway. William Calloway." The silence that followed was electric. Rebecca risked a glance and saw Blackwood's face had gone completely still, all expression wiped away as if a shutter had fallen. "Sir," Mitchell prompted, "does that mean something to you?" Blackwood seemed to shake himself. "No, just making sure we know who we're dealing with." His voice had regained its usual authority. "Keep an eye on her. I want to know if she shows any unusual interests or asks questions about things that don't concern her." "You think she's a problem?" "I think she bears watching." Rebecca finished gathering her gear and left the training area, her mind racing. Blackwood knew her father. The recognition in his eyes when Mitchell had spoken the name had been unmistakable. But was it the recognition of a former comrade or something darker? That evening, Rebecca took a calculated risk. During the brief period when recruits were allowed to write letters home, she approached Sergeant Hamilton, the female drill instructor assigned to Echo Company. "Sir, permission to access the base library for research materials, sir." She stood at rigid attention, her face carefully neutral. Hamilton looked up from her paperwork with a frown. "The library? What kind of research could you possibly need to do, Calloway?" "Marine Corps history, sir. I'm writing to my mother about the training, and I wanted to include some historical context, sir." It was a flimsy excuse, but it played to the Corps' pride in its traditions. Hamilton studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. 30 minutes. Not a second more. And I want to see whatever you write before it goes out." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The base library was small but comprehensive, with a section dedicated to Marine Corps history and another containing military reference materials. Rebecca headed straight for the computers that provided access to the base's electronic archives, limited for recruits, but still potentially useful. She began with a general search for Iraq operations post-Desert Storm, focusing on the period when her father had disappeared. The results were predictably sanitized peacekeeping operations, weapons inspections, the enforcement of no-fly zones. Nothing that hinted at clandestine missions or operations gone wrong. Next, she tried searching for Mirage within the military operation database. This yielded nothing but a technical manual for the French Mirage fighter jet, a dead end, or perhaps a deliberate omission. With time running short, Rebecca shifted tactics. Instead of searching for the operation directly, she looked for personnel records of units deployed to Iraq during the relevant period. This produced a list of official deployments, none of which would have included her father's Delta Force team on a classified mission. But as she scrolled through the list, a name caught her eye: Lieutenant Ethan Blackwood, attached to a Marine reconnaissance unit operating in northern Iraq in March 1991, the exact time and place of her father's final mission. Rebecca felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. It wasn't coincidence. Blackwood had been there when her father disappeared. He knew something, maybe everything. Before she could pursue this thread further, a shadow fell across the computer screen. Rebecca looked up to find Lieutenant Sarah Westbrook, one of the few female officers on base, standing beside her terminal. Unlike the male instructors who radiated hostility, Westbrook's expression was merely curious. Doing some extra studying, Recruit Calloway. Yes, ma'am, Marine Corps history. Westbrook glanced at the screen, and Rebecca tensed, expecting questions about why she was looking at deployment records rather than the stated topic. But the lieutenant merely nodded. Admirable initiative, just don't lose focus on your primary training. History will still be here when you graduate. Yes, ma'am. As Westbrook moved away, Rebecca caught something unexpected in the officer's eyes. Not suspicion, but something that almost looked like recognition. Had Westbrook also served in Iraq? Was she another potential source of information? Before Rebecca could consider this further, Sergeant Hamilton appeared at the library entrance, tapping her watch pointedly. Time was up. That night, as the barracks settled into silence, Rebecca lay awake processing what she'd learned. Blackwood had been in Iraq when her father disappeared. He recognized the Calloway name, and now he was watching her, specifically concerned about what questions she might ask. It was confirmation that she was on the right track, but it also meant the clock was ticking. If Blackwood suspected why she was really at Parris Island, he might take steps to block her investigation or even arrange for her to wash out of the program. From a nearby bunk, she heard Carol Matthews' voice pitched low to avoid attracting attention from the night duty officer. Rebecca, you still awake? Yes. I've been meaning to ask, that move you used today during hand-to-hand, that wasn't standard Marine Corps technique, was it? Rebecca tensed. Had she let too much of her training show? What do you mean? Oh, the counter to the wrist grab. You didn't do it the way Sergeant Sullivan demonstrated. Your version was smoother, more efficient. Just a slight variation, Rebecca replied carefully. My father showed me a few basic self-defense moves before I enlisted. There was a pause, then Carol asked, your father, the Delta Force operator, did he teach you a lot? The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Carol's tone set off warning bells in Rebecca's mind. Some basics, she said noncommittally. Nothing special. Carol seemed to accept this. Well, if you ever want to show me that counter again, I'd appreciate it. It looked effective. Sure, when we get some free time. As the conversation ended and Carol's breathing eventually settled into the rhythm of sleep, Rebecca remained alert, her instincts humming with caution. Was Carol's interest genuine, or was she fishing for information on behalf of someone else? Blackwood had said he wanted Rebecca watched. Had he recruited Carol for that purpose? Trust no one. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from the darkness. Assume everyone has an agenda until proven otherwise. Rebecca closed her eyes but didn't allow herself to sleep. Instead, she began planning her next move. If Blackwood had been in Iraq during Operation Mirage, there would be records somewhere, perhaps not in the official archives, but in personal files, correspondence, or the memories of those who served with him. She needed to find those who had been there who might know the truth. And she needed to do it before Blackwood realized just how much she already suspected. The game had begun in earnest now, and like her father had taught her in those long sessions in the Montana barn, the key to victory wasn't overwhelming force. It was patience, preparation, and the willingness to strike decisively when the moment came. That moment wasn't here yet, but Rebecca could feel it approaching like distant thunder before a storm. The fourth week of training brought new intensity as the recruits began live fire exercises. For Rebecca, it also brought increased scrutiny. Blackwood had become a shadow presence, appearing at unexpected moments during her training evolutions, his cold blue eyes tracking her movements with unsettling focus. She maintained her middle performance strategy, but the constant vigilance was taking its toll. Each night, exhaustion dragged at her like physical weights, yet sleep remained elusive as her mind churned through scenarios and contingency plans. During a particularly grueling day on the rifle range, Rebecca noticed Blackwood in deep conversation with a man she hadn't seen before, an older officer with the insignia of a full colonel. Their body language suggested an intense discussion with the colonel doing most of the talking, while Blackwood listened with rigid attention. When the unknown colonel glanced in her direction, Rebecca quickly returned her focus to her rifle, but she could feel the weight of his assessment like a physical touch. Something was happening. The circle was tightening. That evening, as the female recruits cleaned their weapons in the barracks, Sergeant Hamilton entered with an unusual announcement. "Attention, Colonel Harrison will be observing Echo Company's progress tomorrow. I expect each of you to demonstrate that female recruits are every bit as capable as their male counterparts." Her eyes swept the room with grim determination. "Any questions?" No one spoke. Hamilton nodded once and departed, leaving behind a wake of nervous tension. "Harrison," Carol whispered to Rebecca as they returned to their weapon maintenance. "Isn't he the base commander?" "Deputy Commander," corrected Diaz from the next bunk over, "in charge of training operations. They say he was with Special Forces before taking this posting." Rebecca kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. Harrison, the same name as the major who had presented her with the flag at her father's funeral. Different rank now, but it could be the same man. Was this visit routine, or was it connected to Blackwood's sudden interest in her? Why would a colonel care about watching female recruits? Carol wondered aloud. We're not exactly the pride of the Corps in their eyes. Because we're the future, Diaz replied with unexpected fervor. Whether they like it or not. Rebecca remained silent, focusing on reassembling her rifle with meticulous care. If Harrison was indeed the same man from her father's funeral, his presence was no coincidence. The question was whether he was an ally or another obstacle. Later that night, Rebecca lay in her bunk mentally reviewing what she knew. Blackwood had been in Iraq during her father's final mission. Harrison might have been involved in the aftermath. Both were now at Parris Island, and both were showing unusual interest in her training. There was another piece to this puzzle, one she had almost forgotten in the daily grind of recruit training. After her father's disappearance, a package had arrived at the Montana ranch, a small box containing his personal effects, and a handwritten note that simply said, "He died for the truth. Someone should know." No signature, no return address. Among those effects had been her father's dog tags and a small flash drive. The dog tags she now wore beneath her t-shirt, against regulations but necessary as a constant reminder. The flash drive had contained a single encrypted file that she had never been able to open. The file name, Mirage PGP. Whatever Operation Mirage had been, it had been important enough for her father to risk smuggling out classified information. Important enough that someone had arranged for his disappearance. And now, 6 years later, the key players seemed to be converging around her at Parris Island. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts, the creak of the barracks door opening. Rebecca remained motionless, her breathing deep and regular, as if in sleep, but her senses instantly alert. Footsteps approached, too light for a drill instructor's boots. A shadow fell across her bunk. Through slitted eyes, Rebecca saw Carol Matthews standing beside her bed, looking down at her with an unreadable expression. Carol remained there for several long seconds, then carefully reached toward Rebecca's footlocker. Rebecca continued the pretense of sleep, her muscles coiling with tension. What was Carol looking for? And who had sent her with deft movements that spoke of practice? Carol eased open the footlocker and began silently rifling through Rebecca's meager possessions. When she reached for the small leather case containing Rebecca's father's dog tags hidden beneath a regulation t-shirt, Rebecca made her move. Her hands shot out, fingers wrapping around Carol's wrist with precise pressure on nerve points that caused immediate pain without permanent damage. Carol gasped, her free hand moving to cover her mouth and stifle the sound. "Looking for something," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible but edged with steel. Carol's eyes widened with fear and something else, respect perhaps, or calculation. "I can explain," she breathed. "I'm sure you can." Rebecca maintained the pressure point, hold her eyes never leaving Carol's face. "The question is whether I'll believe you." "Not here." Carol pleaded, her face tight with pain. Someone might hear. Rebecca considered her options. Confronting Carol now risked creating a scene that would draw attention from the night duty officer. But releasing her meant giving up the advantage of surprise. Decision made, Rebecca released the pressure point but maintained her grip on Carol's wrist. Tomorrow, during the obstacle course, you'll hang back with the cramp and I'll stay to help you. Then you'll tell me exactly who you're working for and what you're looking for. Carol nodded quickly, relief flooding her features as the pain subsided. Tomorrow, she agreed. Rebecca released her completely and watched as Carol retreated to her own bunk, massaging her wrist. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. The pretense of friendship was over. As Rebecca lay back down, her mind worked through the implications. Carol was searching her belongings, which meant someone suspected she had brought something to Paris Island, something connected to her father, or to Operation Mirage. But what could they possibly think she had? The encrypted flash drive was secure in a safe deposit box in Montana, not here where it could be discovered. Unless they didn't know about the flash drive at all, what if they were looking for something else entirely? Something her father might have hidden before his disappearance. Something only his daughter might know how to find. The possibility opened new avenues of thought. If her father had hidden evidence about Operation Mirage, evidence that might implicate people still in positions of power, then her presence at Paris Island represented more than a personal quest for answers. It represented a threat. And threats, as her father had taught her, were dealt with ruthlessly in the world of covert operations. Rebecca closed her eyes, her body still but her mind racing. Tomorrow would bring answers from Carol and perhaps a clearer picture of what she was truly up against. But one thing was already certain: she was no longer the hunter in this scenario. She had become the hunted. The Montana barns seemed to materialize around her as sleep finally claimed her consciousness. In this dream memory, her father circled her with measured steps, his voice calm but insistent. Remember, Becky, when you're outnumbered, when you're outgunned, you have one advantage they can never take away. What's that, Dad? Dream, Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. William Wild Bill Calloway smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. They don't know what you're capable of. Not until you show them. In her sleep, Rebecca's fingers curled around the dog tags hidden beneath her shirt. I'll show them, Dad, she promised. When the time is right, I'll show them everything. The morning dawned with a thick blanket of humidity that clung to the skin like regret. Rebecca rose before the wake-up call, her body conditioned through years of pre-dawn training sessions to anticipate the day ahead. As she performed her ablutions with mechanical precision, her mind replayed the previous night's encounter with Carol Matthews. Today would bring answers one way or another. Colonel Harrison's observation of Echo Company was scheduled for the afternoon, which gave Rebecca a narrow window during morning physical training to confront Carol. The obstacle course, a sprawling labyrinth of walls, ropes, and physical challenges, would provide the privacy she needed, assuming Carol kept their arrangement. As the female recruits assembled on the parade ground for morning formation, Rebecca studied Carol's body language from the corner of her eye. The other woman seemed tense, her usual defiant posture now rigid with anticipation or fear. Their eyes met briefly, and Carol gave an almost imperceptible nod. Echo Company, attention, Sergeant Hamilton's voice cracked across the humid morning air. Today's evolution will begin with the obstacle course, followed by classroom instruction on field tactics. Colonel Harrison will be observing your performance this afternoon during live fire exercises. I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you. The recruits responded with a unified, "Yes, sir," Rebecca's voice blending seamlessly with the others. As they moved out toward the obstacle course, she maintained her position in the middle of the formation, neither leading nor lagging. Just another recruit, unremarkable in every way. The obstacle course loomed ahead, its weathered wooden structures glistening with morning dew. The male recruits from Delta Company were already attacking the course, their instructors shouting encouragement laced with profanity. Among them, Rebecca spotted Staff Sergeant Blackwood standing slightly apart, his attention seemingly on his charges, but his posture oriented toward the approaching female recruits. First group on the line, Hamilton ordered. Carol and 4 other recruits, including Diaz, stepped forward. Begin on my mark, 3, 2, 1, move. The first group launched into the course. Rebecca watched as Carol deliberately paced herself, allowing the others to pull ahead. Near the rope wall about midway through the course and partially obscured from the instructor's direct line of sight, Carol stumbled, clutching her side with a convincing grimace of pain. "Matthews, what's the holdup?" Hamilton barked from her position near the starting line. "Cramp, sir," Carol called back, doubling over. Hamilton scowled. "Calloway, assist Matthews and get her back in the race move." "Yes, sir." Rebecca jogged forward exactly as planned. As she reached Carol, she took the other woman's arm, as if helping her stretch out the cramp, using the position to speak without being overheard. "Talk," she said quietly, her face a mask of helpful concern for any observers. "Who are you working for?" Carol's eyes darted nervously to the instructors, then back to Rebecca. "Not who you think," she whispered. "I'm not with Blackwood. I'm with Westbrook." The admission caught Rebecca off guard. Lieutenant Westbrook, the female officer who had observed her in the library. "Explain," she demanded, maintaining the pretense of helping Carol stretch. "Lieutenant Westbrook approached me 2 weeks ago, said she needed someone to keep an eye on you for your own protection." Carol winced as Rebecca applied slightly more pressure than necessary to her arm. "She said Blackwood and Harrison were dangerous, that they were involved in something that got your father killed." Rebecca's mind raced. Westbrook was an unknown variable, possibly an ally, possibly another threat masquerading as a friend. "What exactly did she tell you about my father?" "Not much, just that he was involved in something called Operation Mirage, and that Blackwood was there when he disappeared. She thinks Blackwood recognized you and is worried you're here to expose him." "And what were you looking for in my footlocker last night?" Carol had the grace to look ashamed. "Westbrook wanted to know if you had any documents or evidence from your father. She said if you did, you'd be in danger." Rebecca considered this information. If Westbrook truly was an ally, she represented a potential breakthrough in Rebecca's investigation, but trusting too easily could be fatal. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Verify then trust, never the other way around." "Tell Westbrook I want to meet with her," Rebecca decided. "Somewhere private, off base if possible." Carol nodded. "She said you might say that. There's an old veterans bar about 2 miles from the main gate, Murphy's. She said she could arrange for you to get a pass this weekend for family reasons and meet you there." The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. "Looking better, Matthews," Sergeant Hamilton called as she strode toward them. "Or do you need to visit medical again?" "Much better, sir," Carol replied, straightening up with exaggerated care. "Just needed to stretch it out. Then finish the course, both of you. Move." As they rejoined the training evolution, Rebecca's mind sorted through this new information. Westbrook knew about Operation Mirage. She considered Blackwood and Harrison threats. And she had enough influence to arrange an off-base pass for a recruit in the middle of basic training, no small feat. Was it a trap? Possibly. But it was also the first real lead Rebecca had found since arriving at Parris Island. The risk was necessary. That afternoon, as Colonel Harrison observed the live-fire exercises, Rebecca felt his eyes tracking her specifically. He was a tall man with silver-gray hair, in the ramrod posture of career military, his face a study in controlled authority. If this was indeed the same Major Harrison who had presented her with the flag at her father's funeral, he had aged considerably in 6 years, not just in rank, but in the deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes. When her turn came at the firing line, Rebecca demonstrated competent but unremarkable marksmanship. She grouped her shots within the acceptable range for a recruit at this stage of training, neither outstanding enough to draw praise, nor poor enough to warrant correction. As she stepped back from the line, she caught Harrison speaking quietly to Blackwood, their heads inclined toward each other in confidential discussion. Harrison's eyes flicked toward her, then away, his expression unreadable. That evening, Rebecca received a folded note with her mail call. Inside was a small newspaper clipping about a local veterans memorial service with a handwritten note in an elegant script, "Saturday 1400, come alone, WW." The pieces were falling into place. Now she just needed to survive until Saturday without raising further suspicion. Murphy's Bar sat just outside the commercial strip that had grown around Parris Island, like barnacles on a ship's hull. Unlike the neon-lit establishments catering to young Marines on weekend, Liberty Murphy's was a weathered clapboard structure with a small faded sign and windows tinted by decades of cigarette smoke. It was the kind of place where old soldiers went to remember in peace, not where young ones went to forget. Rebecca approached, cautiously wearing civilian clothes for the first time in weeks, simple jeans and a t-shirt that her mother had sent in a care package, ostensibly for her off-base liberty upon graduation. The temporary pass in her pocket, authorized for family emergency consultation, had raised no eyebrows at the gate. Lieutenant Westbrook apparently had influence indeed. The interior of Murphy's was cool and dark, the afternoon sun barely penetrating the smoke-stained windows. A few old men sat at the bar, their postures suggesting former military even without the Vietnam-era unit caps some wore. Classic country music played softly from an ancient jukebox, Johnny Cash lamenting follies and regrets. Rebecca scanned the room with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Westbrook wasn't immediately visible, but a grizzled man in his 70s, seated alone in a corner booth, raised a hand in subtle greeting. Rebecca approached cautiously, her senses alert for any sign of a trap. "Ms. Calloway," the old man said as she reached his table. "Jack Murphy. This is my establishment." His voice was a gravelly rumble, worn by years and whiskey. "Sarah, Lieutenant Westbrook asked me to speak with you first. Have a seat." Rebecca slid into the booth, positioning herself with a clear view of both the front door and the rear exit. "Where is Lieutenant Westbrook?" "She'll be along. Thought it best not to arrive together. Draw attention." Murphy studied her with rheumy blue eyes set deep in a face weathered by time and experience. "You look like him, you know. Same eyes, same way of taking in everything without seeming to." Rebecca stilled. "You knew my father?" It wasn't a question, but Murphy nodded anyway. "Served with Bill in Desert Storm. Different branches, he was Army, I was Marines, but special operations puts you in the same sandbox, so to speak." He took a sip from a glass of amber liquid. "Damn fine soldier. Better man. What can you tell me about Operation Mirage?" Murphy's eyes narrowed slightly. Direct, just like him. He glanced around the bar, then leaned forward. "Not much officially. It wasn't my operation. But I knew something went very wrong. Bill was troubled in the weeks before he disappeared. Said he'd seen something that couldn't be ignored, that wouldn't let him sleep at night." "What did he see, Maitre Bell?" "He never said exactly, but it had to do with a village near the Kurdish territories. Something about testing effects." Murphy's voice dropped even lower. "Bill was a patriot through and through, but he had lines he wouldn't cross. Said some of the others didn't." "Others like Blackwood." Murphy's expression hardened. Ethan Blackwood was a lieutenant then. Ambitious. The kind who believed the ends justified the means. He took another drink. "After Bill disappeared, Blackwood was promoted quickly. Too quickly, some thought." Rebecca absorbed this information, fitting it into the puzzle she'd been assembling. "And Colonel Harrison?" "Major Harrison back then. He was the one who announced Bill was dead, though they never found a body. Said it was an ambush, that Bill died saving his men." Murphy's gaze became distant. "Never sat right with me. Bill was too good, too careful to be caught in a standard ambush." The front door opened, admitting a shaft of sunlight that momentarily illuminated the dim interior. Lieutenant Sarah Westbrook entered, dressed in civilian clothes, a simple blouse and slacks that nonetheless carried the crisp precision of her military bearing. She spotted Rebecca, and Murphy nodded once and made her way to their booth. "Recruit Calloway," she said quietly as she slid in beside Murphy. "Thank you for coming." "Not sure I had much choice, ma'am," Rebecca replied evenly, "since you've been having me watched." Westbrook had the grace to look slightly abashed. "A precaution. For your protection, not surveillance. When I realized who you were, who your father was, I knew you'd need allies." She glanced at Murphy, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Jack has told you about his connection to your father." "Some, not enough." Rebecca leaned forward. "I want to know what Operation Mirage was and what happened to my father. The real story, not the official one." Westbrook exchanged another look with Murphy before responding. "Operation Mirage was classified above top secret. It officially never existed, but rumors persist among those who served in that region during that time." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father was part of a joint special operations team sent to investigate reports of chemical weapons in a remote village near the Kurdish territories. What they found there changed things." "Changed how?" "The chemicals weren't at Iraqi," Murphy interjected, his voice rough with old anger. "At least not entirely. Some of the components came from U.S. sources. experimental stuff that was never supposed to be deployed. Rebecca felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. Are you saying we were testing chemical weapons on Iraqi civilians? Not we, as in the U.S. military officially, Westbrook clarified quickly. A splinter group. People with access and authority who believed that the end of the Gulf War was premature, that we should have pushed all the way to Baghdad. They were setting up conditions for a second invasion. By using chemical weapons, that's insane, Murphy finished for her. Criminally insane, but they wrapped it in patriotism and necessity. Your father didn't buy it. He gathered evidence, documented everything, said he was going to bring it all back, make sure the right people saw it. But he never made it back, Rebecca said softly. Westbrook nodded. The official report says his team was ambushed by Iraqi insurgents. 3 survived: Blackwood, Harrison, and a corporal named Jenkins, who was medically discharged shortly after returning stateside. And you don't believe the official report? No. Westbrook's voice was firm. I was a junior intelligence analyst assigned to review field reports from that region. The ambush report had inconsistencies that were never addressed, witness statements that contradicted each other, and forensic evidence that didn't match the narrative, such as the timing, the reported wounds, the lack of enemy casualties despite a supposedly intense firefight. Westbrook hesitated, and there was blood evidence at the scene that was never properly accounted for. Rebecca processed this information, her face revealing nothing despite the turmoil inside. You think my father was executed, not ambushed? It wasn't a question, but Murphy answered anyway. Bill knew too much, was going to expose something ugly that powerful people needed to keep buried. His gnarled hands tightened around his glass. Men like that, they wrap themselves in the flag, while they betray everything it stands for. A heavy silence fell over the booth. Rebecca stared at the scarred, wooden table, seeing instead her father's face the last time she'd seen him alive, strong, confident, but with a shadow behind his eyes that she'd been too young to fully understand. Why are you telling me this now? She finally asked, looking up at Westbrook. Why not 6 years ago? Because I didn't have enough proof then. Just suspicions and inconsistencies. Westbrook leaned forward, but when Blackwood was assigned to Parris Island as an instructor, and then Harrison followed as deputy commander, I knew something was happening. They're closing ranks, protecting each other. And then you arrived, William Calloway's daughter, enlisting under her own name, as if challenging them to recognize her. I came for the truth, Rebecca said simply. The truth could get you killed, Murphy growled, just like it got your father killed. I'm not afraid to die. No, Westbrook said softly, but you should be afraid of dying before you can expose what happened, before you can get justice for your father. Rebecca considered this. What do you suggest? Caution, Westbrook replied immediately. Play the game. Be the recruit they expect, competent, but not exceptional. Don't give Blackwood any reason to accelerate whatever timetable he's on. Meanwhile, Murphy added, we'll try to locate Jenkins, the 3rd survivor. Last I heard, he was living off the grid somewhere in the Appalachians. If anyone knows what really happened that day, it's him. And if Blackwood makes a move against me before then? Rebecca asked. Westbrook's expression hardened. That's why I've been having Carol watch you. At the first sign of unusual activity, I'll intervene. I have some influence with the base commander, not enough to move directly against Harrison, but enough to protect you if necessary. Rebecca nodded slowly. The strategy was sound. Continue, as she had been gathering information while presenting an unthreatening facade. But a part of her, the part her father had trained since childhood, chafed at the defensive posture. One more thing, she said. In my father's personal effects, there was a flash drive with an encrypted file labeled Mirage PGP. I've never been able to open it. Westbrook's eyes widened slightly. That could be the evidence he was gathering, the documentation that got him killed. I need to decrypt it. PGP encryption from that era would be difficult, but not impossible to crack with the right resources, Westbrook mused. But attempting it might raise flags in certain monitoring systems. I know someone, Murphy interjected. Old Spook, who retired from the NSA, lives about an hour from here. If anyone can crack it without setting off alarms, it's him. He scribbled a name and an address on a bar napkin and slid it across to Rebecca. But getting the flash drive here without raising suspicion will be tricky. I can handle that, Rebecca said, tucking the napkin into her pocket. My mother can mail it in a care package. Nothing unusual about families sending personal items to a recruit. Westbrook nodded approval. Good. Meanwhile, keep your head down and your eyes open. Blackwood is dangerous, but he's also cautious. He won't move against you without being certain of success. As if summoned by his name, the door to Murphy's bar swung open, and a familiar silhouette appeared against the afternoon sunlight. Rebecca felt her muscles tense as Staff Sergeant Ethan Blackwood stepped into the dim interior, his eyes scanning the room with predatory focus. Murphy cursed under his breath. Speak of the devil. Don't react, Westbrook murmured. He may just be here for a drink. This place is popular with instructors, too. But as Blackwood's gaze landed on their booth, a cold smile spread across his face. He moved toward them with unhurried confidence, his civilian clothes, pressed jeans, and a polo shirt doing nothing to diminish his military bearing. Well, well, he said as he reached their table. Lieutenant Westbrook, Mr. Murphy. His eyes settled on Rebecca with glacial intensity. And Recruit Calloway. What an interesting gathering. Was to Staff Sergeant Westbrook acknowledged, her voice professionally neutral. Enjoying your weekend liberty? Immensely, Barkin, Blackwood replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. Especially now that I've had the opportunity to confirm some suspicions. He turned his attention fully to Rebecca. Family emergency Calloway Strange, since your mother called the base yesterday to check on your progress, and she sounded in perfect health. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, her face betraying nothing despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. My pass is in order, Staff Sergeant. Oh, I'm sure it is. Lieutenant Westbrook is known for her administrative efficiency. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. I'm simply concerned that a recruit under my instruction is being distracted from her training by outside influences. I wasn't aware Echo Company was under your instruction, Staff Sergeant, Westbrook interjected coolly. Last I checked, Sergeant Hamilton was their primary DI. We all contribute to molding these recruits, Lieutenant. Blackwood's tone remained pleasant, but his posture had subtly shifted to one of contained aggression. Some of us simply take our responsibilities more seriously than others. The tension at the table was palpable. Murphy, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke, his gravelly voice cutting through the standoff. You're disturbing my customers, Blackwood. Either order a drink or move along. Blackwood's cold gaze shifted to the old Marine. Mr. Murphy, still fighting old wars, I see. Some advice from a younger generation: the past should stay buried. Digging it up rarely brings comfort to anyone. His eyes flicked meaningfully to Rebecca, especially when what's buried might be better left forgotten. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Rebecca felt a cold anger rising within her, the kind her father had taught her to channel rather than suppress. But now was not the time. Not yet. I'll be heading back to base, she said, sliding out from the booth with deliberate calm. Thank you for your assistance with my family matter, Lieutenant Westbrook. Westbrook nodded, understanding the tactical retreat. Of course, Recruit. Family should always come first. As Rebecca moved toward the door, Blackwood stepped slightly to block her path, not enough to be obvious intimidation, but enough to force her to adjust her course around him. As she passed, he spoke quietly for her ears alone. You look just like him, you know. Same eyes, same misguided sense of righteousness. The words were almost gentle, which somehow made them more menacing. He had that same look right before the end. Rebecca froze her body instantly, combat ready despite her outward calm. Is that a confession, Staff Sergeant? Blackwood's smile widened fractionally. A observation, Recruit, and a friendly warning. Some paths lead nowhere good. Your father discovered that. I'd hate to see history repeat itself. History has a way of doing that, Rebecca replied softly, especially when people don't learn from it. She continued past him and out the door, her mind racing, but her steps measured and unhurried. The confrontation had changed everything. Blackwood had shown his hand, confirmed his connection to her father's death, and issued what amounted to a direct threat. The pretense was over. Now it was war. The Montana winter howled outside the converted barn, snow piling against the walls as if trying to bury the structure and its occupants. Inside, 14-year-old Rebecca circled her father warily, both of them barefoot on the sawdust-covered floor, breath visible in the cold air. despite the wood stove burning in the corner. "You're overthinking," William Calloway said, his voice calm, despite the intensity of their sparring session. "Feel the rhythm, Becky. Don't analyze it." Rebecca nodded, adjusting her stance. She had been training with her father for 7 years now, mastering disciplines from karate to jiu-jitsu to Filipino knife fighting. But today's lesson was different, less about technique and more about instinct. "Again," her father instructed. "This time, don't watch my hands. Watch my center." They engaged once more, moving through a complex series of attacks and counters. Rebecca focused as instructed, seeing not the individual's strikes, but the flow of energy between them. For a brief moment, everything aligned, her body responding without conscious thought, anticipating rather than reacting. Then it was over. Her father stood 3 feet away, a rare smile softening his weathered features. "There," he said. "That's what I'm talking about. You felt it, didn't you?" Rebecca nodded, understanding dawning. "It's like seeing without looking." "Exactly." He moved to the small table where 2 steaming mugs waited, gesturing for her to join him. "The body knows things the mind hasn't processed yet. The Japanese call it mushin, the mind without mind. It's what separates good fighters from great ones." Rebecca wrapped her cold hands around the warm mug, savoring the rich scent of the hot chocolate her father always prepared for their winter training sessions. "Is that how you survived all those missions, by using mushin?" A shadow passed across William Calloway's face there, and gone so quickly Rebecca might have imagined it. "Partly," he admitted, "but survival isn't just about winning fights, Becky. Sometimes it's about knowing which fights to avoid entirely." "You mean like walking away?" "Sometimes. Other times it means waiting for the right moment." He took a thoughtful sip from his mug. "Remember the story of the Battle of Thermopylae? The 300 Spartans who held off the Persian army?" Rebecca recited, familiar with her father's love of military history. "Most people focus on the Spartans' bravery, their willingness to die for their cause. But the real genius was in their strategy, choosing the right battleground, one that neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage." His gray eyes, so like her own, held hers with unusual intensity. "If you're outmatched, change the conditions of the fight. Is that what you do in Delta Force?" Another shadow longer this time. "I try to, but sometimes orders come down that put you in impossible situations. Situations where victory and doing the right thing aren't the same." Rebecca frowned, sensing a depth to his words that she couldn't quite grasp. "What do you do then?" "You make a choice." Her father's voice had gone quiet, almost distant. "And you live with the consequences." Before she could ask what he meant, he seemed to shake off whatever dark thoughts had gripped him, returning to the practical lesson at hand. "The point is, Becky, true mastery isn't about accumulating techniques. It's about understanding when and how to use them." He set down his mug and reached for a small wooden box on a nearby shelf. "Which brings me to today's real lesson." From the box, he removed what appeared to be a standard military dog tag on a chain, but as he handed it to Rebecca, she noticed unusual markings etched into the metal alongside the standard identification information. "This is a special tag," her father explained. "The markings are a code one used by certain Delta operators for emergency extraction. If you're ever in a situation where all other options have failed, where you need immediate help and conventional channels are compromised, this will identify you to the right people." Rebecca turned the tag over in her hands, studying the seemingly random pattern of notches and symbols. "Why are you giving me this?" Her father was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the storm raging outside the barn windows. "Because the world is unpredictable and I won't always be there to protect you. This is insurance." "Against what?" "Against the day when you might have to make the kind of choice I mentioned." He turned back to her, his expression grave. "Keep it hidden but accessible. And Becky, only use it if absolutely necessary. The kind of help it summons comes with its own complications." Rebecca slipped the chain around her neck, tucking the tag beneath her training shirt. She didn't fully understand her father's concerns, but she recognized the seriousness in his voice. "I'll be careful," she promised. "I know you will." He smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Now let's get back to work. Show me that moment of mushin again." As they resumed their training, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that her father was preparing her for something specific, something he feared but couldn't or wouldn't name. It was only years later, after his disappearance, that she began to understand the true purpose of that winter's lessons. He had been preparing her for a war he knew was coming, a war that had finally arrived at Paris Island, and the week following the confrontation at Murphy's Bar brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere at Paris Island. Rebecca returned to find Echo Company's training schedule suddenly altered: more combat exercises, fewer classroom sessions, and an emphasis on high-stress scenarios that seemed designed to push the female recruits to their breaking points. Sergeant Hamilton, never particularly nurturing but at least professionally neutral toward the women under her command, had been temporarily reassigned. Her replacement, a hard-faced woman named Sergeant Carter, drove the female recruits with unprecedented harshness. "Again," Carter barked as Rebecca and the others struggled through their 15th repetition of a combat drill in the punishing Carolina heat. "Until every one of you can execute this perfectly, we don't stop." Rebecca maintained her middle-of-the-pack performance, though it required increasing effort to deliberately hold back as her body wanted to shift into the efficient combat movements her father had drilled into her. She noted with concern that the other women were flagging badly, Diaz fighting through obvious exhaustion, and Carol Matthews favoring her previously injured ankle. Blackwood watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. Beside him stood Colonel Harrison, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight as he made notes on a clipboard with methodical precision. "They're trying to break us," Carol muttered as they reset for another repetition. "Especially you." Rebecca gave a nearly imperceptible nod. After the confrontation at Murphy's, Carol had fully committed to Westbrook's camp, serving as a conduit for information between the lieutenant and Rebecca. "Conserve energy," she whispered back. Short steps, controlled breathing. The afternoon brought no relief, only a transition to the rifle range where they were subjected to a modified qualification course that even the male recruits hadn't attempted yet. The targets appeared and disappeared with brutal speed, giving them split seconds to acquire aim and fire. "This is beyond standard training," DS observed quietly as they waited for their scores. "It's like they're setting us up to fail." Rebecca suspected the truth was more specific. They were setting her up to fail, or perhaps more dangerously, setting her up to reveal her true capabilities in order to succeed. Either outcome would serve Blackwood's purposes. Washing her out of the program would remove her from Paris Island and end her access to potential information, while exceptional performance would confirm his suspicions about her training and give him justification for more direct action. It was a carefully constructed trap. The question was how to navigate it without falling into either pitfall. That evening, Lieutenant Westbrook managed a brief, seemingly casual encounter in the mess hall, stopping by the female recruits' table for what appeared to be a standard check-in. "Challenging day, recruits?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral, though her eyes conveyed a different message to Rebecca. "Yes, ma'am," they responded in unison. "Good. The Corps isn't supposed to be easy." Westbrook's gaze lingered on Rebecca. "Sometimes the greatest test isn't the obstacle itself, but how we choose to approach it." The message was clear. Maintain the facade, don't rise to the provocation. Rebecca gave a slight nod of understanding. As Westbrook moved away, Rebecca noticed Blackwood watching the interaction from across the mess hall, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. He was assessing, strategizing. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Her father had once told her that the most dangerous enemies weren't the angry ones, but the patient ones, those who could wait for the perfect moment to strike. Later that night, as the barracks settled into silence, Carol slipped a folded note beneath Rebecca's pillow during a brief moment when the duty officer's attention was elsewhere. Rebecca waited until lights out to retrieve it, reading the message by the dim emergency lighting that never fully disappeared. "Jenkins found, W arranging meeting. 3 days. Be ready." 3 days. Rebecca tucked the note into her mouth, dissolving the thin paper as her father had taught her to do with sensitive communications. 3 days to maintain her cover, to survive whatever escalating pressure Blackwood and Harrison applied without revealing her true capabilities. The next morning brought confirmation that the pressure would indeed increase. Sergeant Carter assembled the female recruits before dawn, her face grimly satisfied in the harsh illumination of the barracks lights. "Special training evolution today," she announced. "By direct order of Colonel Harrison, Echo Company, will participate in advanced close-quarters combat scenarios. Staff Sergeant Blackwood and his instructors will be providing expert guidance. The emphasis she placed on those last words left little doubt about what that guidance would entail. As the female recruits exchanged nervous glances, Rebecca kept her expression neutral, her mind already gaming out scenarios and responses. The training facility was usually reserved for advanced Marine combat courses, not basic recruits. Its interior had been configured to simulate an urban environment, plywood walls creating a maze of rooms and corridors that teams had to navigate while engaging pop-up targets and avoiding civilian cutouts. What made Rebecca's stomach tighten, however, was the presence of Blackwood's entire cadre, Mitchell, Ramirez, Cooper, and Sullivan, all geared up in protective padding and carrying training weapons. This wasn't going to be a standard exercise. Echo Company will demonstrate room-clearing techniques, Carter announced to the assembled recruits. Each of you will enter the course individually and proceed through the scenario. The opposing force, she gestured to Blackwood and his men, will represent hostile elements. Your objective is to navigate the course and reach the extraction point without being killed or captured. Rebecca analyzed the setup with growing concern. This was far beyond normal recruit training. This was the kind of high-intensity scenario used for special operations preparation. The other women of Echo Company with their limited training would be thoroughly outmatched. "Matthews, you're first," Carter barked. "On my mark." Carol stepped forward, her face pale but determined. As she entered the course, Rebecca watched Blackwood give subtle hand signals to his team, deploying them to specific positions within the maze. What followed was difficult to watch. Carol moved cautiously through the course, trying to apply the basic techniques they'd been taught, but she was hopelessly outclassed. Within minutes, Ramirez had captured her using a takedown that was unnecessarily rough, given the training context. Diaz fared slightly better, making it approximately halfway through the course before Mitchell and Cooper cornered her in a simulated alleyway, subjecting her to a barrage of strikes that, even with protective gear, left her visibly shaken. One by one, the women of Echo Company entered the course, and one by one they were systematically dismantled by Blackwood's team. The male recruits watching from the sidelines shifted uncomfortably, many recognizing that what they were witnessing went beyond tough training into something more personal, more targeted. "Calloway," Carter finally called. "You're up." Rebecca stepped forward, her mind clear despite the obvious trap before her. Blackwood wanted her to fail, or perhaps more accurately, he wanted to force her to reveal her true capabilities by making failure too painful to accept. Either outcome would serve his purposes. As she prepared to enter the course, she caught Lieutenant Westbrook watching from near the entrance, her face carefully composed but her eyes radiating concern. Nearby stood Colonel Harrison, his silver hair gleaming under the facility lights, his expression one of clinical interest rather than military assessment. Decision time. Rebecca entered the course at Carter's signal, moving with the slightly hesitant posture of a basic recruit while her mind mapped the layout with professional precision. The first room was clear, but her trained senses detected movement in the corridor beyond Sullivan, waiting in ambush around the corner. A standard recruit would walk into the trap. A fully deployed Rebecca Calloway would neutralize the threat with brutal efficiency. Neither option served her long-term objectives. Instead, she chose a middle path, approaching the corner with slightly more caution than a typical recruit might show, but not with the tactical awareness that would reveal her training. When Sullivan made his move, she reacted with just enough skill to avoid the worst of his takedown attempt, but not enough to prevent him from driving her against the plywood wall. "Too slow, Calloway," Sullivan muttered, as he applied a restraint hold that was just at the edge of acceptable training pressure. "In the real world, you'd be dead already." Rebecca allowed herself to struggle ineffectively for a moment, playing the part of the outmatched recruit. Then, as Sullivan began to relax his grip, thinking her subdued, she executed a basic escape maneuver. Nothing extraordinary, just the standard technique they'd been taught in hand-to-hand sessions. Sullivan, surprised by her sudden movement, lost his grip. Rebecca broke free and continued through the course, moving with increased urgency, but still within the parameters of what could be expected from a motivated recruit. The next intersection brought her face-to-face with Cooper, who wielded a padded training baton with the confidence of someone accustomed to physical dominance. He swung at her with controlled but significant force, clearly intending to end her run through the course. Rebecca sidestepped the movement just quick enough to avoid the worst of the impact, but not so precise as to seem suspicious. The baton glanced off her shoulder, and she used the momentum to create distance between them. "Not bad, Calloway," Cooper said, circling to cut off her escape route. "But not good enough." He lunged again, and this time Rebecca allowed the strike to connect more solidly, dropping to one knee as if stunned by the impact. Cooper moved in to apply a restraint hold, his guard momentarily lowered by his apparent success. That brief opening was all Rebecca needed. She surged upward, suddenly executing a basic shoulder check that caught Cooper off balance. It wasn't a sophisticated technique, just a desperate move that any corner recruit might attempt, but the timing was perfect, sending Cooper stumbling backward into a plywood wall. Without waiting to see if he recovered, Rebecca continued through the course, her breathing deliberately more labored than her exertion warranted. She could sense the watching eyes of Blackwood, Harrison, and the others evaluating every move, every decision. Two more rooms cleared without encounter, then a narrow corridor where she detected Ramirez waiting in ambush. This time, rather than trying to evade or counter, she simply accelerated, attempting to sprint past the danger zone, a reckless but not unreasonable choice for a recruit under pressure. Ramirez lunged as she passed, catching her with a sweeping leg that sent her sprawling onto the padded floor. Before she could recover, he was on her, his massive weight pinning her down as he applied a chokehold that pressed dangerously against her carotid artery. "End of the line, Calloway," he growled, the pressure increasing until black spots danced at the edges of her vision. This was the critical moment, the point where Blackwood would expect her either to submit completely or to reveal her true capabilities in a desperate bid to escape. Either response would serve his purpose. Instead, Rebecca chose a third option. As consciousness began to fade, she tapped Ramirez's arm repeatedly, the universal signal of submission in training scenarios. The pressure eased slightly, and Ramirez began to release her, confident in his victory. In that moment of transition, Rebecca executed a move that threaded the needle perfectly, a basic defensive technique taught to all recruits, but applied with just enough unexpected timing to catch Ramirez off guard. She twisted beneath him, creating a small space, then drove her elbow up into his solar plexus with precisely calibrated force, enough to cause discomfort, but not enough to suggest advanced training. Ramirez grunted in surprise, his grip loosening further. Rebecca scrambled free and continued down the corridor, her movements now ragged with apparent fatigue, her breathing harsh in the enclosed space. The final section of the course loomed ahead, a large open area that represented the extraction point. But standing between her and completion was Blackwood himself, waiting with the patient posture of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to run. "Impressive, Calloway," he said as she entered the space, keeping his voice low enough that the observers couldn't hear. "You've made it further than your colleagues." But then I expected nothing less from William Calloway's daughter. Rebecca stopped several feet away from him, her posture that of an exhausted recruit rather than a combat-ready operator. "Just trying to complete the course, Staff Sergeant. Are you—" Blackwood's cold smile never reached his eyes. "Or are you playing a longer game? Your father was good at those too, right up until the end." Rebecca felt a surge of cold anger quickly suppressed. "I don't know what you mean, Staff Sergeant." "I think you do." Blackwood began circling slowly, forcing Rebecca to turn to keep him in view. "I think you came to Paris Island for answers, not a career. I think you've been hiding your true capabilities, waiting for the right moment." His voice dropped even lower, just like he did. The parallel was deliberate, designed to provoke an emotional response. Rebecca kept her breathing steady, her expression neutral. "I'm just trying to become a Marine Staff Sergeant." "No," Blackwood replied softly. "You're trying to be your father's daughter." But William Calloway made a fatal mistake, Rebecca. He thought he could stand alone against forces he didn't understand. Forces that were bigger than one man's conscience. The admission was there, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Blackwood had been involved in her father's death, perhaps directly responsible. The confirmation sent a surge of adrenaline through Rebecca's system, but she channeled it inward, using the energy to sharpen her focus rather than betray her emotions. "The extraction point is behind you, Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "May I proceed?" Blackwood's smile widened fractionally. "Of course, but first a final test." Without warning, he lunged forward, executing a perfectly formed strike aimed at her midsection fast enough and hard enough that dodging it completely would reveal advanced training, while absorbing it fully would end her run through the course. Time seemed to slow as Rebecca made her decision. She twisted slightly, allowing the strike to connect with her side rather than her solar plexus, painful, but not debilitating. The impact drove the air from her lungs and she allowed herself to stagger backward, one hand clutching her ribs. Blackwood pressed his advantage, moving in with a follow-up strike aimed at her shoulder. Rebecca dropped to one knee, seemingly off balance, but actually creating a smaller target profile. The move caused Blackwood's strike to graze her upper arm rather than connecting solidly. "Better than expected," Blackwood murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, but still holding back. He circled again, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your father held back too until it was too late. Don't make his mistake." The taunt was calculated to draw her out, to make her reveal herself. Rebecca felt the temptation like a physical pull, the desire to show this man exactly what she was capable of, to wipe the cold confidence from his face with the techniques her father had spent years teaching her. But that was exactly what he wanted. A display of advanced combat skills would confirm his suspicions and give him the justification he needed for whatever he had planned next. Instead, Rebecca gathered herself and made a desperate lunge toward the extraction point, leaving herself deliberately open on her right side, a rookie mistake that any trained fighter would exploit. Blackwood took the bait, stepping in to intercept her with a sweeping leg takedown that sent her sprawling onto the padded floor mere feet from the extraction point. Before she could recover, he was on her, applying a joint lock to her right arm that sent shooting pain through her shoulder. "It's over, Calloway," he said loud enough for the observers to hear. "Submit." Rebecca gritted her teeth against the pain, making a show of struggling ineffectively against the hold. Then, as if in a final desperate effort, she twisted her body violently, accepting the increased pain in her shoulder in exchange for creating enough momentum to roll closer to the extraction point. Blackwood, momentarily surprised by the reckless move, adjusted his grip, but not before Rebecca had managed to stretch out her free hand, slapping the marked area that signified completion of the course. "Extraction point reached," announced Sergeant Carter, her voice tight with what might have been disappointment. "Recruit Calloway has completed the course." Blackwood released the joint lock, immediately rising to his feet with fluid grace. His expression gave nothing away, but as Rebecca slowly stood favoring her right shoulder, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger or frustration, but a calculating reassessment. "Well done, recruit," he said formally. "Limited tactical awareness, but strong determination. Qualities the Corps values." As Rebecca rejoined the other female recruits, she caught Lieutenant Westbrook's gaze from across the facility. The lieutenant gave a nearly imperceptible nod of approval. Rebecca had walked the line successfully, demonstrating enough skill to complete the course, but not enough to confirm Blackwood's suspicions about her true capabilities. Round 1 to Rebecca Calloway. But as she rotated her sore shoulder, feeling the deep ache from Blackwood's joint lock, she harbored no illusions about the battles to come. Blackwood hadn't been defeated, merely delayed. And judging by the way Colonel Harrison was studying her, making notes on his ever-present clipboard, the next round would be even more challenging. 3 days until the meeting with Jenkins, the last man who might know the full truth about Operation Mirage and her father's fate. 3 days to maintain her cover and survive whatever escalating tests Blackwood and Harrison devised. 3 days that might determine whether she found justice for her father or joined him in whatever unmarked grave had received his body. As Echo Company was dismissed from the training facility, Rebecca felt a small, hard object pressing against her chest beneath her t-shirt. Her father's dog tag with its coded markings, the insurance he had given her during that long-ago winter in Montana. She had never fully understood its purpose until now. If all else failed, if Blackwood moved against her directly, the tag represented a final option, a call for help to people even her father had been reluctant to involve. Rebecca straightened her shoulders despite the pain, her resolve hardening. She would not need to use the tag. 3 more days of caution and control, then answers from Jenkins. The truth about Operation Mirage was within reach. What she didn't yet realize was that Blackwood had plans of his own. For those 3 days, plans designed to push her beyond control, beyond caution, to the breaking point her father had reached 6 years earlier in the blood-soaked sand of northern Iraq. The following morning brought rain, a relentless downpour that transformed the Paris Island training grounds into a morass of mud and standing water. Rather than providing relief from the punishing physical regime, the weather only intensified it, with Sergeant Carter driving Echo Company through extended periods of combat conditioning in the deluge. "The enemy doesn't stop because of a little rain," she barked as the female recruits performed endless series of burpees in the muddy parade ground, their uniforms sodden and heavy. "Neither does the Corps." Rebecca maintained her position in the middle of the formation, executing each exercise with deliberate control. Not the effortless precision her training would have allowed, but the determined struggle of a capable recruit pushing through exhaustion. Her shoulder throbbed where Blackwood had applied the joint lock the previous day, but she kept the discomfort from showing on her face. Nearby, Carol Matthews was clearly struggling, her previously injured ankle causing her to falter on each repetition. Yet she persisted, her expression set in grim determination. Rebecca had developed a genuine respect for the woman who had become her unlikely ally. When the morning evolution finally ended, the recruits were given 30 minutes to clean themselves and their gear before classroom instruction. As Rebecca changed into a dry uniform, Carol approached, keeping her voice low beneath the general noise of the barracks. "They're accelerating the timetable," she murmured, seemingly adjusting her own uniform. "Westbrook says the meeting with Jenkins has been moved up. Tomorrow night, not 3 days from now." Rebecca absorbed this information without visible reaction. "Why the change, Harrison's been making calls to Washington. Westbrook thinks they're bringing in reinforcements, people connected to whatever happened in Iraq." The implications were clear. Their window of opportunity was closing faster than anticipated. "Where's the meeting?" Rebecca asked methodically, lacing her boots. "Off base. Murphy's arranging transportation." Carol hesitated. "It's risky. If you're caught off base without authorization—" "I know the consequences," Rebecca interrupted quietly. Unauthorized absence during basic training was a serious offense, potentially resulting in discharge or even charges under certain circumstances. "I'll handle it." Before Carol could respond, the barracks doors swung open, admitting Sergeant Carter's rigid form. "Classroom formation in 2 minutes," she announced. "Move it." The afternoon brought a shift in the training schedule, a classroom session on modern combat scenarios, presented by Colonel Harrison himself. As the female recruits filed into the classroom, Rebecca noted the unusual presence of several senior officers along with Blackwood and his cadre of instructors. Harrison stood at the front of the room, his silver hair immaculate, his uniform a study in precision. Behind him, a projection screen displayed a map of northern Iraq with specific regions highlighted in red. "Today's lesson," Harrison began without preamble, "concerns the realities of combat in politically complex environments, specifically operations conducted during the post-Gulf War period in Iraqi Kurdistan." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with her still damp uniform. This was no standard curriculum. This was a message directed specifically at her. Following the successful conclusion of Operation Desert Storm, Harrison continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a career officer. "Specialized units were deployed to secure sensitive sites and gather intelligence on Saddam Hussein's weapons programs." As he spoke, images appeared on the screen, aerial photographs of remote villages, terrain maps of mountainous regions, and occasionally ground-level shots of military units operating in austere conditions. Rebecca studied each image with careful attention, looking for any clue related to Operation Mirage. These operations required difficult decisions. Harrison said, his gaze sweeping the room but lingering briefly on Rebecca. Decisions about which intelligence to trust, which local forces to ally with, and how to respond when mission parameters conflicted with immediate tactical realities. And the subtext was clear to Rebecca, if not to the other recruits. Harrison was talking about moral compromises, about situations where orders and conscience might diverge, about the very scenario her father had likely faced. In March of 1991, Harrison continued advancing to a new slide showing a small village nestled in a valley between stark mountains. A special operations team was deployed to investigate reports of chemical weapons production in this remote area near the Turkish border. Rebecca's pulse quickened. This had to be it, the location of Operation Mirage. She committed the image to memory, noting distinctive terrain features that might help identify the exact location later. The team's mission was straightforward: confirm or deny the presence of prohibited weapons and secure any discovered materials. Harrison's voice had taken on a subtly different quality, harder, more personal. What they found instead was a complex situation with no clear solutions. The next slide showed the aftermath of what appeared to be an attack, buildings reduced to rubble, smoke rising from multiple locations across the village. An insurgent element attacked the team as they approached the village, Harrison stated. In the ensuing firefight, secondary explosions triggered what was later confirmed to be a hidden chemical weapons cache. The results were regrettable. The clinical description couldn't mask the horror of the next image: bodies scattered across the village square, civilians caught in what had clearly been a devastating release of chemical agents. Rebecca fought to maintain her neutral expression, but inside pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The team leader, Harrison continued, and now his eyes fixed directly on Rebecca, made a decision to prioritize the evacuation of his men over the collection of evidence regarding the source of these weapons. It was a difficult choice, but the correct one under the circumstances. The lie was delivered with perfect conviction, but Rebecca knew it for what it was. This wasn't what had happened. Her father wouldn't have abandoned civilians to a chemical attack, nor would he have left without documenting the truth of what had occurred. Unfortunately, Harrison added, his tone shifting to one of regret. The team leader was killed during the extraction, a decorated officer named Colonel William Calloway. A murmur ran through the classroom at the unusual mention of a specific name in what had ostensibly been a general tactical discussion. Several recruits glanced at Rebecca, making the connection to her surname. Colonel Calloway received a posthumous Silver Star for his actions that day, Harrison concluded. His sacrifice saved the lives of his men and prevented sensitive information from falling into enemy hands. The fabrication was expertly constructed, close enough to potential truth to be believable, far enough from reality to conceal whatever had actually happened. Rebecca maintained her composure with effort, focusing on her breathing as her father had taught her during stressful situations. Questions? Harrison asked, his gaze still fixed on Rebecca. The room was silent. The other recruits seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected detour into what appeared to be classified military history. No questions about the tactical decisions made, the prioritization of personnel over intelligence gathering, Harrison pressed. Calloway, any thoughts from a military family perspective? The direct challenge couldn't be ignored without appearing suspicious. Rebecca met Harrison's gaze steadily. Sir, without complete information about the situation, it would be presumptuous for a recruit to question the decisions made by experienced officers in the field, sir. A diplomatic non-answer that neither endorsed nor challenged the narrative Harrison had presented. The colonel's lips curved in what might have been a smile on another man. Wisely stated, recruit. Sometimes the most important quality in a Marine is knowing when to follow orders without question, even when those orders might seem questionable. The warning was thinly veiled. Harrison was making it clear that he expected compliance and silence, not investigation and justice. As the classroom session concluded and the recruits filed out, Rebecca felt Blackwood's presence before she saw him standing just outside the doorway with the patient posture of a predator awaiting its prey. Interesting lesson, he commented as she passed. Family history can be so educational, don't you think? Rebecca continued walking, giving no indication that his words had affected her, but inside her resolve hardened. Harrison's carefully constructed narrative confirmed what she had long suspected. Her father had died because he refused to participate in a cover-up, because he had evidence of something so damning that powerful men were still working to keep it buried 6 years later. That evening, as Echo Company performed weapons maintenance in the barracks, Rebecca noticed Carol Matthews watching her with unusual intensity. Throughout the day, Carol had been increasingly withdrawn, her earlier solidarity replaced by a nervous tension that manifested in darting glances and abrupt movements. When the female recruits were finally dismissed for their brief personal time, before lights out, Rebecca deliberately lingered at her footlocker, organizing her minimal possessions with methodical precision. As expected, Carol approached her posture, radiating anxiety. "The meeting tomorrow," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "It's set for 2200 hours. Murphy will have a car waiting behind the old supply building on the north perimeter. Lieutenant Westbrook has arranged for the guard rotation to create a 10-minute window." Rebecca nodded, continuing her organizational task without looking up. Thank you. Carol hesitated, then added, be careful. After today's lesson, it's clear they're sending you a message. I received it, Rebecca replied quietly, loud and clear. As Carol turned to leave, Rebecca noticed something that sent a warning signal through her trained senses, a slight bulge in the pocket of Carol's utility trousers, the outline suggesting an object approximately the size and shape of a small recording device. In that moment, several seemingly disconnected observations suddenly aligned in Rebecca's mind, Carol's increasing nervousness throughout the day, her unusual insistence on discussing the extraction plan in the barracks rather than during outdoor training where electronic surveillance would be more difficult. The way she had positioned herself during their conversation to ensure Rebecca's responses would be clearly captured. The realization was like ice water in her veins. Carol Matthews wasn't working for Lieutenant Westbrook, she was working for Blackwood. Rebecca maintained her composure with effort, giving no indication that she'd noticed anything amiss. Get some rest, she said, closing her footlocker with deliberate calm. Tomorrow will be challenging. Carol nodded and moved away, her hand unconsciously brushing against the pocket containing the recording device. As she reached her own bunk, Rebecca saw her glance toward the barracks door, where a shadow briefly darkened the frosted glass panel. Someone watching, listening, waiting for Carol's report. The betrayal stung more than Rebecca had expected. Despite knowing that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, she had begun to consider Carol a genuine ally. Now it was clear that every conversation, every confidence had been reported directly to Blackwood, which meant the planned meeting with Jenkins was almost certainly a trap. Rebecca lay on her bunk that night, eyes closed but mind racing through contingency plans. If Carol was Blackwood's informant, then everything had been compromised: the meeting location, the extraction route, possibly even Lieutenant Westbrook's involvement. She needed to warn Westbrook, but with Carol watching her every move, direct communication was impossible. As the barracks settled into darkness and the sounds of sleep filled the room, Rebecca made her decision. The original plan was compromised, but that didn't mean she had to abandon her objective. If Blackwood expected her to attempt to meet Jenkins at the arranged time and place, she would need to change both. She would need to move first and alone. Carefully, silently, Rebecca eased from her bunk, her movements liquid in the darkness. Years of training with her father in night operations served her now, as she navigated the darkened barracks without a sound. She paused beside Carol's bunk, confirming with a glance that the woman was truly asleep, not merely pretending. Then, with the stealth that had once allowed her father to infiltrate enemy compounds undetected, Rebecca Calloway slipped from the barracks and into the rainy night, a shadow among shadows bound for answers that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. The rain fell in steady sheets across Parris Island, reducing visibility to ghostly shapes and muted shadows. Rebecca moved through this liquid curtain with practiced silence, her body low and efficient as she navigated between buildings. The base at night was a different world, still controlled by the rigid patterns of military discipline, but with gaps and blind spots known only to those who understood how security systems actually functioned rather than how they appeared on paper. Her father had taught her those gaps, those vulnerabilities. Security is only as good as the people maintaining it, he'd told her during one of their night exercises on the Montana property. And people are creatures of habit and comfort. The Marine Guards patrolling the perimeter followed predictable patterns, seeking shelter from the rain at regular intervals, pausing under overhangs to light cigarettes or check their watches. Rebecca used these moments to cross open spaces, her dark clothing blending with the shadows, her movements timed precisely to the rhythms of human behavior. Her destination wasn't Murphy's Bar or the meeting point Carol had revealed. Those locations were compromised. Instead, she headed for the base administration building where Lieutenant Westbrook had mentioned keeping an office. If there was any chance of salvaging her investigation, she needed to warn Westbrook about Carol's betrayal and access whatever information the lieutenant had gathered about Jenkins' location. The administration building stood dark and seemingly deserted, its windows blank eyes staring out into the rainy night. Rebecca circled it, once noting the security cameras and their coverage patterns, identifying the blind spots with practiced ease. The side entrance, partially sheltered by an architectural overhang, offered the best approach. The door was locked as expected. Rebecca retrieved a small kit from inside her boot, basic tools that her father had insisted she always keep accessible. 30 seconds of careful manipulation, and the lock yielded with a soft click. She slipped inside, easing the door closed behind her. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the soft green glow of exit signs and the occasional blinking light of office equipment. Rebecca moved silently down the corridor, counting doors until she reached the one with Lieutenant S. Westbrook on a simple nameplate. This lock was simpler, designed for privacy rather than security. Rebecca had it open in seconds, then carefully closed and relocked the door behind her once inside. Westbrook's office was small but meticulously organized, with case files stacked in precise order and a bulletin board covered with maps and photographs that had been carefully draped with a cloth cover, hiding them from casual observation while allowing quick access. Rebecca removed the cover, revealing what was clearly Westbrook's private investigation into Operation Mirage. Photos of northern Iraq satellite imagery of a specific village, personnel files with certain names highlighted, including Blackwood Harrison, and a third man identified as Michael Jenkins. Strings connected various elements, creating a visual representation of Westbrook's analysis. In the center was a photograph of William Calloway in his dress uniform, his expression serious, but his eyes carrying the hint of the same intensity Rebecca saw in her own mirror. She studied the board carefully, committing key details to memory. Jenkins' last known location was marked on a small map of the southeastern United States, a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, approximately 3 hours' drive from Parris Island. Beside it was a notation: cabin, no phone, monthly supply runs to Dawson's General Store. Rebecca was photographing the board with a small, disposable camera she'd purchased before arriving at Parris Island when she heard the almost imperceptible sound of the outer door opening, followed by careful footsteps in the corridor. She immediately doused the small pen light she'd been using, plunging the office into darkness. Years of training took over as she moved silently to position herself beside the door where she would be hidden when it opened. The footsteps paused outside Westbrook's office. A key slid into the lock with deliberate care. The door eased open and a figure slipped inside, closing the door before reaching for the light switch. Rebecca struck first, clamping one hand over the intruder's mouth while simultaneously applying precise pressure to the carotid artery with her forearm, not enough to cause unconsciousness, but sufficient to establish control. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even in the silence of the office. The figure stiffened, then relaxed slightly. A familiar scent registered, the same subtle perfume Lieutenant Westbrook wore. Rebecca eased her grip but maintained her position of advantage. "Lieutenant," she murmured, still not fully releasing her hold. A muffled affirmation came against her palm. Rebecca removed her hand from Westbrook's mouth but kept her in the control position. "Dibika Watkato," Westbrook said softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "I see your father taught you more than basic self-defense." "Carol Matthews is working for Blackwood," Rebecca replied, ignoring the observation as she finally released her hold entirely. "The meeting is compromised." Westbrook turned slowly, her expression visible now in the faint light filtering through the office blinds. "I know," she said. "That's why I came to find you. I realized something was wrong when she reported your conversation about the extraction plan with far too much detail." "You knew she was a plant." Rebecca's voice hardened. "Not until today." Westbrook moved to her desk, retrieving a small flashlight that she kept pointed downward to minimize visible light. "I genuinely thought she was trustworthy when I recruited her. Blackwood must have gotten to her afterward, threatened her, or perhaps offered her something she couldn't refuse." Rebecca processed this information, evaluating Westbrook's sincerity. The lieutenant's body language and vocal patterns suggested she was telling the truth, but caution had become Rebecca's default position. "The meeting with Jenkins," she said. "Is it real?" "Jenkins is real and he's agreed to talk, but not at Murphy's bar and not tomorrow night." Westbrook gestured to the bulletin board. "He's in hiding in the mountains. Hasn't trusted anyone connected to the military since Iraq. Murphy convinced him to meet with you, only you, because of who your father was." "I need to go now," Rebecca decided, "before Blackwood realizes I'm gone and locks down the base." Westbrook studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll need transportation and civilian clothes." "I can provide both, but getting you off base won't be simple. Security has been tightened on Harrison's orders, ostensibly for a training exercise, but the timing is suspicious." "I can handle base security," Rebecca assured her. "My father made sure of that." Something flickered in Westbrook's eyes, respect perhaps, or concern. You really have been training for this your whole life, haven't you? Rebecca didn't answer directly. Where can I find transportation? Westbrook moved to her desk drawer, retrieving a set of keys and a hand-drawn map. My personal vehicle is parked behind the commissary in the civilian lot. Take these back roads, she indicated a route on the map, and you'll reach the mountain area in about 3 hours. The cabin is unmarked, but Jenkins will have a blue lantern in the window if it's safe to approach. Rebecca accepted the keys and map, tucking them securely in her pocket. What about you? Blackwood will suspect your involvement when I disappear. Let me worry about Blackwood, Westbrook replied with unexpected steel in her voice. I've been building a case against him and Harrison for years. I just needed the final piece, Jenkins' testimony about what really happened in that village. And if Jenkins confirms what we suspect, that American forces were involved in chemical weapons testing on civilians, Westbrook's expression hardened. Then I take everything to the JAG office and the Inspector General simultaneously. Even Blackwood and Harrison have superiors who won't tolerate war crimes no matter how deeply they're buried. Rebecca nodded, satisfied with the answer. I should go. The longer I'm away from the barracks, the greater the risk of discovery. Wait. Westbrook hesitated, then reached into her desk once more, removing the small service pistol. Take this. Jenkins is unstable, paranoid after what he witnessed, and if Blackwood somehow tracks you, she left the sentence unfinished as she offered the weapon. Rebecca accepted it without comment, checking the chamber and safety with practiced hands before securing it in her waistband at the small of her back. One more thing, Westbrook said as Rebecca moved toward the door. Your father. I didn't know him personally, but his reputation. He was considered one of the best. Whatever happened in that village, I believe he tried to do the right thing. I know he did, Rebecca replied simply. That's why they killed him. With that, she slipped out of the office and back into the rainy darkness, a ghost moving through a world of rigid structures and rules that had never quite contained her. Dawn broke over the Appalachian Mountains in a misty watercolor of pale gold and blue, the trees emerging from darkness like sentinels guarding ancient secrets. Rebecca guided Westbrook's sedan along a narrow gravel road that switchbacked up increasingly steep terrain, the vehicle's tires occasionally slipping on surfaces still damp from the night's rain. She had driven through the darkness, stopping only once at a 24-hour gas station to refuel and change into the civilian clothes Westbrook had provided: simple jeans, a flannel shirt, and a weathered jacket that wouldn't attract attention in rural North Carolina. The disposable cell phone Westbrook had included remained silent. No call meant no discovery of her absence yet, or at least no emergency requiring communication. The directions led her finally to a small clearing where the road simply ended, transitioning into a footpath that continued up the mountainside. Rebecca parked the car beneath a stand of pines, concealing it from casual observation, then gathered the minimal supplies she'd brought: water, energy bars, the pistol secure at her back, and a small first aid kit that had been in Westbrook's glove compartment. The hike took nearly an hour, the trail sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reemerge around the stands of ancient oaks or rocky outcroppings. Rebecca moved with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to wilderness navigation, her senses alert for any sign that she was being followed or observed. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a small, weathered structure that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself, its timber walls darkened by decades of exposure. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, and no movement was visible through the windows, but Rebecca approached with heightened caution nonetheless. Jenkins had survived Iraq and 6 years of hiding. He wouldn't be careless about security. She circled the cabin once, noting the carefully arranged stones near what appeared to be a game trail, an improvised alarm system that would alert an occupant to approaching visitors. The blue lantern Westbrook had mentioned sat unlit in the front window, its presence a signal, but its condition a warning. Jenkins was here, but not necessarily welcoming visitors. Rebecca stopped at the edge of the small clearing surrounding the cabin, deliberately visible rather than concealed. Michael Jenkins, she called as her voice carrying in the mountain stillness. My name is Rebecca Calloway. I'm William Calloway's daughter. Silence answered her, but she felt the weight of observation eyes tracking her from one of the cabin's darkened windows. She remained still, hands visible at her sides in the universal gesture of non-threat. I'm alone, she continued after a moment. I've come about Operation Mirage, about what happened in that village. The cabin door opened with painful slowness, revealing a bearded man in his 50s, his face weathered by time and hardship, his eyes holding the haunted look of someone who had seen things that humans weren't meant to witness. A shotgun rested in his hands, not quite pointed at her, but certainly not pointed away. "Calloway's kid," he said, his voice a rusty growl from infrequent use. "You got his eyes." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca nodded confirmation anyway. Jenkins studied her for a long moment, then stepped back from the doorway. "Might as well come in. Been waiting 6 years for someone to show up asking these questions. Figured it'd be them coming to finish not you." The cabin's interior was sparse but meticulously organized, a single room with a wood stove, a simple bed, a table with 2 chairs and shelves lined with books, canned goods, and what appeared to be journals. One wall was covered with maps and newspaper clippings reminding Rebecca of Westbrook's bulletin board, but more extensive, more obsessive in its detail. Jenkins gestured to one of the chairs, setting his shotgun within easy reach as he took the other. "You want to know what happened to your father?" he stated flatly. "Yes," Rebecca replied, equally direct. "And I want to know what Operation Mirage really was." Jenkins was silent for a long moment, his haunted eyes studying her as if gauging her readiness for the truth he carried. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to come from his very soul, he began to speak. "It was supposed to be a standard WMD verification mission. Early '91, after Desert Storm officially ended, intelligence said the village might be a storage or a production site for Saddam's chemical weapons program. Your father was in command. I was just a corporal attached as the team's communications specialist." He paused, his gaze turning inward to memories he clearly wished he could forget. "We reached the outskirts of the village before dawn. Standard procedure, observe first, then move in with local Kurdish fighters as guides and translators. But something didn't feel right to your father. The village was too quiet. No normal morning activity, no smoke from cooking fires." Jenkins rose suddenly, moving to a locked trunk in the corner of the cabin. He returned with a battered leather journal, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from frequent reading. "I kept a record," he explained, opening the journal to a marked page. "Not the official one that was altered later. The real one." He pushed the journal toward Rebecca, who recognized immediately the precise military notation style grid, coordinates, timestamps, personnel assignments. The entry was dated March 17, 1991, and began with a standard mission briefing format. "Your father ordered us to maintain our observation position longer than planned," Jenkins continued as Rebecca scanned the journal. "Said his instincts were warning him. Blackwood, he was a lieutenant, then got impatient, argued that we were wasting time, that the intel was solid." Rebecca looked up from the journal. "Blackwood wanted to move in immediately." Jenkins nodded, his expression darkening. "He and Harrison both. They had some kind of secondary orders that your father wasn't privy to initially. Something about securing specific materials for transport back to U.S. control. Chemical weapons." Rebecca said, the pieces aligning with what Westbrook had theorized. "Yes and no." Jenkins leaned forward, his voice dropping, as if the mountains themselves might be listening. "What we didn't know, what your father discovered only when he intercepted a communication that wasn't meant for him, was that the chemical weapons weren't Iraqi. They were ours." Despite her mental preparation for this possibility, Rebecca felt the revelation like a physical blow. American chemical weapons in an Iraqi village. "Experimental compounds," Jenkins confirmed grimly, "developed by a defense contractor under a black budget program. Supposedly more humane, incapacitating agents that could neutralize enemy forces without permanent harm." His laugh was a bitter, broken sound. "At least that's what they claimed they were." Rebecca processed this information, her trained mind assembling the tactical implications. They were using the chaos after Desert Storm to conduct unauthorized field tests. "Bingo," Jenkins tapped a finger against the journal. "Your father figured it out when he intercepted a transmission about control groups and exposure metrics. These weren't weapons being secured. This was an experiment being documented." "What did he do?" "What William Calloway always did, the right thing regardless of orders." Jenkins' voice carried unexpected respect. He confronted Harrison, who was the mission's executive officer, demanded to know who had authorized American chemical agents on foreign soil, especially in a civilian population. Jenkins fell silent, his gaze once more turned inward to that distant morning in Iraq, When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming somehow both harder and more vulnerable. Harrison tried to play it off as a need-to-know operation, said your father should focus on perimeter security while he and Blackwood handled the sensitive materials. But your father wasn't having it. He ordered the team to stand down, said he was reporting directly to CENTCOM about unauthorized weapons testing. And that's when it happened, Rebecca asked quietly. Jenkins nodded, his face haunted by the memory. Harrison gave some kind of signal to Blackwood. Next thing I knew, there was a firefight, but not with Iraqis. Our own team divided against itself. His hands trembled slightly as he turned a page in the journal. Your father ordered those loyal to him to secure the village civilians while he dealt with Harrison. I was manning the radio, monitoring all communications. That's when I heard it. Heard what? Harrison, on a channel he thought was private, ordering the package to be detonated rather than fall under scrutiny. Blackwood acknowledged the order. Jenkins looked up, his eyes filled with 6 years of accumulated horror. They triggered the chemical release, deliberately knowing the village was full of civilians, knowing some of our own men were in the exposure zone. Rebecca felt cold fury building inside her, but kept her expression neutral as she absorbed this information. My father, he tried to stop them, almost succeeded too. Jenkins turned another page, revealing a hand-drawn map of the village with positions marked in faded ink. He reached the storage location just as Blackwood was setting the detonation timer. There was a struggle. Your father managed to alert our medic to begin civilian evacuations, but he couldn't stop the release entirely. And then, Jenkins closed the journal, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Official report says he was killed by insurgent fire during evacuation. The truth? He met Rebecca's gaze directly. Blackwood shot him, point blank. I saw it happen through my field glasses from my position on the ridge. Harrison was there too, gave the order himself when your father threatened to provide evidence to the International Criminal Court. The confirmation of what she had long suspected should have been devastating, but Rebecca felt instead a strange calm descending, the absolute clarity that came with certainty after years of questions. What evidence? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. Jenkins hesitated, then reached beneath his shirt to withdraw a dog tag on a chain, similar to the one Rebecca wore but with different markings. Your father managed to get this to me before the confrontation with Blackwood. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it reached you or your mother. He handed it to Rebecca, who recognized it immediately as matching the encrypted flash drive she had found among her father's returned effects, the one labeled MirageBot PGP. It's a decryption key, Jenkins explained. The notches and marks correspond to a cipher. Your father documented everything: the unauthorized weapons, the decision chain that brought them to that village, the deliberate exposure of civilians. He even took samples, had them analyzed by a Kurdish doctor before the mission went sideways. Rebecca closed her hand around the dog tag, feeling its edges press into her palm. This is what they've been afraid of all these years. Why Blackwood recognized me at Parris Island. Why Harrison created that false narrative about my father's heroic death. They've built their careers on that lie, Jenkins confirmed. Harrison's a full colonel, now being considered for general. Blackwood's on a similar trajectory. The defense contractor that developed the chemicals. They've got billions in government contracts, connections all through the Pentagon. And the consequences for the village, for the people exposed. Jenkins' expression crumpled slightly. Birth defects, neurological disorders, cancer clusters, all officially attributed to Saddam's chemical programs, of course. International aid organizations have documented it all, but without proof of the actual source. He trailed off, the implication clear. Rebecca sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what she had learned. Her father had died trying to expose a war crime, American chemical weapons tested on Iraqi civilians, followed by a deliberate cover-up that persisted to this day. I need to get this information to Lieutenant Westbrook, she finally said. She has the connections to launch an official investigation. Jenkins shook his head sharply. No military channels. They've buried this for 6 years already. The only way to break through is to go public, completely public. Media, international organizations, all at once. That would require irrefutable proof, Rebecca pointed out. Your testimony alone is worthless, I know. Jenkins reached into the trunk again this time, withdrawing a sealed waterproof case. That's why your father created this. Complete documentation, sample analysis, photographs, location data, everything needed to prove what happened and who was responsible. He placed the case on the table between them. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment, the right person. I think he always knew it would be you who came looking. Rebecca stared at the case, understanding its explosive potential. Blackwood and Harrison, they'll do anything to prevent this from coming to light. They already have, Jenkins replied grimly. 2 other team members died in accidents within a year of returning stateside. A Kurdish doctor who helped your father disappeared without a trace. They're thorough and they're protected by people in very high places. Then why haven't they come after you? A bitter smile crossed Jenkins' weathered face. They think I'm harmless, traumatized, discredited. After I was discharged for psychological instability, I made sure to play the part, ranting about conspiracies to anyone who would listen, mixing just enough obvious delusion with the truth that no one took me seriously. His eyes hardened. It was the only way to stay alive, long enough to keep my promise to your father. Rebecca nodded, understanding the strategy. Sometimes the best hiding place was in plain sight, wrapped in a disguise that enemies would dismiss rather than investigate. I need to get back to Paris Island, she said, rising from her chair. If I'm discovered missing, any chance of using this information effectively disappears. Jenkins studied her for a moment, then nodded. Take the case. And this. He handed her the journal. My testimony written contemporaneously. It won't be enough alone, but combined with your father's evidence. It will be enough, Rebecca assured him, securing both items in the backpack Westbrook had provided. And Jenkins, thank you for keeping your promise all these years. The older man's eyes glistened with unexpected moisture. Your father was the best man I ever served with, the only officer who cared more about doing right than doing what was ordered. He cleared his throat gruffly. He talked about you, you know, out there in the desert, showed us pictures, said you were smarter than him, tougher too in your own way. Rebecca felt a tightness in her throat that threatened her composure. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, then turned toward the door. Jenkins' voice stopped her. They'll be waiting, you know. Men like Blackwood and Harrison, they plan for contingencies. If they've realized you're gone... I know, Rebecca replied, her hand resting briefly on the pistol at her back. But they've never seen what I can really do. My father made sure of that. The return journey passed in a blur of focused determination. Rebecca drove through the mountain roads and back toward Paris Island with mechanical precision, her mind working through scenarios and contingency plans. The evidence in her backpack represented not just justice for her father, but potentially salvation for an entire village, still suffering the effects of unauthorized chemical testing. The disposable phone rang as she crossed back into South Carolina, the sound jarring in the quiet car. Westbrook's voice came through when she answered, tense but controlled. Your absence has been discovered. Blackwood has initiated a search claiming concern about your mental state after yesterday's historical lesson. You're being painted as emotionally unstable, potentially suicidal. Rebecca absorbed this information with clinical detachment, laying groundwork to discredit anything I might reveal. Smart. It gets worse, Westbrook continued. Harrison has called in a specialized security team ostensibly for a training exercise. They arrived an hour ago, 4 men with the bearing and equipment of special operators, though they're wearing civilian clothes and carrying credentials from a private security firm. Contractors, Rebecca translated. Deniable assets if anything goes wrong. Exactly. I've tried to delay things by suggesting you might be at the base chapel or medical facility, but that won't hold for long. If you're going to return, it needs to be now while I can still control the narrative. Rebecca checked the time, 0500, still early enough that her return might be explained as a pre-dawn reflection period rather than an unauthorized absence. I'm 30 minutes out. Can you secure the evidence once I'm back on base? Yes, meet me at the old boathouse on the eastern perimeter. It's isolated and I can create a reason to be there for morning physical training assessment. Understood. Rebecca ended the call, then accelerated slightly, pushing the sedan faster along the empty pre-dawn highway. Dawn was breaking as she approached Paris Island, the sky lightening to the pale gray of approaching sunrise. She parked Westbrook's car in its designated spot behind the commissary, then moved on foot toward the eastern perimeter, staying within the shadows of buildings and using the early morning PT formations as cover. The old boathouse stood apart from the main facilities, a weathered wooden structure that had once supported the base's maritime training operations, but now served mainly for equipment storage. As Rebecca approached through the tall marsh grass surrounding it, she noted with approval that Westbrook had chosen well. The location offered multiple escape routes and clear sight lines in all directions. Lieutenant Westbrook was waiting inside, her expression tense but composed. She wore standard PT gear, maintaining the fiction of conducting official business. "Did you find Jenkins?" she asked without preamble as Rebecca slipped through the side door. Rebecca nodded and slingling her backpack. "He confirmed everything we suspected and more. It wasn't just unauthorized chemical weapons testing, it was deliberate exposure after my father threatened to report it. Blackwood pulled the trigger personally on Harrison's order." Westbrook's face hardened. "Bastards. I knew it was bad, but—" She shook her head. "Did Jenkins provide any actual evidence?" In answer, Rebecca removed the waterproof case and journal from her backpack. "Everything. Documentation, photographs, sample analysis. My father was thorough." Relief flooded Westbrook's features as she accepted the materials. "This is enough, more than enough. I have a secure channel to the Inspector General's office, a former academy classmate who can't be bought or intimidated. Once this is in her hands, not even Harrison's connections can bury it." "How soon?" "I can make the transfer by 0800. Until then—" Westbrook stopped abruptly, her head turning toward the boathouse door. "Did you hear that?" Rebecca had the subtle sound of footsteps on the wooden dock outside, too controlled to be a casual visitor. She moved instantly to a position beside the door, drawing the service pistol from her waistband as Westbrook secured the evidence case inside her jacket. "Could be routine patrol," Westbrook whispered, though her expression suggested she didn't believe it. Rebecca shook her head slightly. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too measured, someone trying to move quietly, rather than the confident stride of regular security. She gestured for Westbrook to take the journal and move toward the back exit. The door crashed open before they could move, admitting two men in civilian tactical gear, weapons drawn. Behind them came Staff Sergeant Plant Blackwood, his cold eyes scanning the boathouse interior until they locked on to Rebecca. "Recruit Calloway," he said, his voice carrying the same calm it always did. "You've caused quite a concern with your unauthorized absence. And Lieutenant Westbrook, what a surprise to find you involved." Westbrook straightened her bearing, shifting from tension to authoritative command. "This recruit was following my direct orders, Staff Sergeant. A special evaluation of her readiness for advanced training given her family background." It was a good attempt at cover, but Blackwood's smile indicated he wasn't fooled. "Is that so interesting that this evaluation coincided with a visit to a certain mountain cabin in North Carolina? A cabin belonging to a former Corporal Michael Jenkins." The revelation that they had been tracked sent a cold wave through Rebecca's system, but she kept her expression neutral. Westbrook, to her credit, didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about, Staff Sergeant. Now, if you and your associates will excuse us, we have a training evolution to complete." Blackwood's smile widened fractionally. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Lieutenant. Colonel Harrison has ordered a full security review after Recruit Calloway's concerning behavior yesterday. These gentlemen are here to escort both of you between the briefing." The gentlemen in question had positioned themselves strategically, one covering the main entrance, one moving toward the rear exit, effectively boxing them in. They moved with the precision of experienced operators, their weapons held low but ready. "This is highly irregular," Westbrook objected, maintaining her officer's authority. "Any debriefing should be conducted through proper channels with appropriate representation." "These are the proper channels, Lieutenant." Colonel Harrison's voice came from the doorway as he entered, his silver hair gleaming in the early morning light filtering through the boathouse windows. "When matters of national security are involved, standard protocols are adjusted." Rebecca assessed the situation with cold clarity. 4 armed men, the 2 contractors, Blackwood and Harrison, against herself and Westbrook. The lieutenant was capable but not specially trained for combat. The odds were poor but not impossible. What changed the calculation was the evidence. As long as Westbrook carried the case and journal, she was the primary target. If the situation deteriorated into violence, she would be the first neutralized. Rebecca made her decision in an instant, shifting slightly to catch Westbrook's eye. A subtle nod toward the rear exit communicated her intent. The lieutenant's almost imperceptible widening of eyes acknowledged understanding. "Colonel Harrison," Rebecca said, drawing attention to herself as Westbrook edged marginally toward the rear of the boathouse. "I think we all know why you're really here. It's not about my concerning behavior. It's about Operation Mirage." Harrison's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a moment of calculation, of reassessment. "I'm not familiar with any operation by that designation, recruit." "No, that's strange, considering you were the executive officer on the ground in that Kurdish village. In March 1991, the village where American chemical weapons were deliberately deployed against civilians." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Harrison's mask of professional concern slipped slightly, revealing a flash of cold anger beneath. "Careful, recruit. Unfounded accusations against superior officers can result in serious consequences." "They're not unfounded, though, are they?" Rebecca continued, noting how the contractor's attention had shifted more fully to her, tracking her as the primary threat, exactly as she intended. Jenkins confirmed everything. The unauthorized weapons test. The deliberate detonation after my father threatened to report it. Your direct order to Blackwood to eliminate witnesses. Harrison's facade cracked further. Jenkins is a documented psychiatric case. His delusions about what happened in Iraq have been thoroughly discredited. Delusions supported by photographs, by soil and tissue, samples, by contemporaneous documentation. Rebecca took a small step forward, drawing all eyes to her movement. "My father was thorough, Colonel. He knew men like you would try to bury the truth along with him." Harrison and Blackwood exchanged a glance that confirmed everything: guilt calculation and the cold determination to eliminate threats to their carefully constructed narrative. "I think we're done here," Harrison said, his voice hardening. "Gentlemen, secure both the recruit and the lieutenant. This matter requires a more private debriefing facility." The contractors moved with professional efficiency, weapons now fully raised. Behind them, Blackwood's hand moved to his sidearm, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Now, Lieutenant," Rebecca called, launching herself into motion with explosive speed. What followed was a demonstration of why William Wild Bill Calloway had spent 15 years training his daughter in combat techniques from around the world. Rebecca moved like liquid lightning, closing the distance to the nearest contractor before he could properly track her with his weapon. Her first strike targeted his brachial plexus, the nerve cluster where the shoulder meets the neck, with precision that instantly numbed his arm, causing the weapon to drop from nerveless fingers. Her follow-up came not as a predictable second strike to the same target, but as a sweeping leg maneuver that took the man's feet from under him, sending him crashing to the boathouse floor with controlled violence. The second contractor adjusted quickly, bringing his weapon to bear with professional speed. But Rebecca was already moving again, using the fallen man as a launching point to drive herself forward in a rolling dive that carried her beneath the weapon's aim. From the low position, she struck upward, targeting the solar plexus with the heel of her hand, not a killing blow, but a precisely calculated strike that drove the air from the man's lungs and disrupted his autonomic nervous system momentarily. As he doubled over, Rebecca rose in a fluid motion that placed her inside his guard, where she delivered a short, sharp strike to the mastoid process behind his ear, just enough force to disorient without causing permanent damage. "Lieutenant, go!" she shouted as she relieved the dazed contractor of his weapon, noting with satisfaction that Westbrook was already moving toward the rear exit. Blackwood drew his sidearm with impressive speed, but Rebecca was already anticipating the move. She dropped and rolled as his first shot splintered the wooden wall behind where she had been standing, coming up in a shooter's stance with the contractor's weapon aimed center mass at Blackwood. "Drop it, Staff Sergeant," she ordered, her voice carrying the absolute authority her father had taught her to project in combat situations. For a moment, the tableau held Rebecca and Blackwood with weapons trained on each other. Harrison half-turned toward the fleeing Westbrook, the two contractors struggling to regain their equilibrium. Then Blackwood smiled, a cold expression entirely devoid of humanity. "You really are his daughter," he said, his aim never wavering. He had the same look right before I shot him. That same misguided certainty that right would somehow prevail over necessity. "Last chance," Rebecca warned, noting that Harrison had drawn his own weapon and was tracking Westbrook, who had nearly reached the rear exit. "You won't shoot," Blackwood said with quiet confidence. You're too much like him, too concerned with rules and consequences. That's what he never understood about men like us. We do what's necessary without hesitation. His finger tightened on the trigger. Rebecca fired first not at Blackwood, but at the overhead light fixture between him and Harrison. Glass and sparks showered down, momentarily disrupting their vision and aim. In that crucial second, Rebecca launched herself forward, executing a combat roll that brought her up directly in front of Blackwood. Before he could reacquire his target, she struck a devastating combination that her father had drilled into her over thousands of repetitions. Palm heel to the chin, snapping his head back. Elbow strike to the floating ribs, collapsing his posture forward. Knee to the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. Blackwood went down hard, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. Rebecca kicked it away, then turned to face Harrison, who had recovered enough to bring his weapon to bear on her arm. Enough, the colonel barked, his silver hair disheveled from the sudden violence, his weapon rock-steady despite his age. Whatever Westbrook thinks she's going to do with Jenkins' fabrications, it won't matter. The system protects its own Miss Calloway. Always has, always will. You're wrong, Rebecca replied, her breathing controlled despite the exertion of combat. The system isn't monolithic. There are still people who care about truth, about justice. My father was one of them. Your father was naive, Harrison sneered. He thought exposing what happened in that village would somehow change things. All it would have done was destroy careers and undermine America's position internationally. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. Is that how you justify killing civilians, experimenting on an entire village? Murdering American soldiers who wouldn't go along with your war crime? Harrison's expression hardened. History is written by the survivors, Ms. Calloway. A lesson your father learned too late. He raised his weapon, centering it on her chest. A lesson you're about to learn as well. The hammer clicked back. Rebecca tensed, calculating angles and distances, knowing that even her training might not be enough to dodge a bullet at this range. The shot, when it came, was deafening in the enclosed space of the boathouse, but it didn't come from Harrison's weapon. The colonel staggered, a look of profound surprise crossing his features as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. He turned slowly, almost comically, to see Lieutenant Westbrook in the doorway, service pistol extended in a perfect two-handed grip, her expression grimly determined. For the record, she said as Harrison collapsed to his knees, the system doesn't protect war criminals. It eventually holds them accountable. Rebecca moved quickly to secure Harrison's weapon as the colonel fell forward onto the rough wooden floor. The two contractors, seeing the tide turn decisively, raised their hands in surrender. You good? Westbrook asked, moving to check Harrison's pulse with professional detachment. Rebecca nodded, keeping her weapon trained on Blackwood, who was struggling to regain his breath after her devastating combination. I thought you were evacuating with the evidence. Changed my mind, Westbrook replied simply. Couldn't leave you to face them alone. Your father wouldn't have. The reference to William Calloway brought a tight smile to Rebecca's lips. No, he wouldn't have. Blackwood, recovering enough to speak, glared up at them with undisguised hatred. You think this changes anything? Harrison has connections all through the Pentagon, friends in the intelligence community. This will be buried by noon. I don't think so, came a new voice from the main entrance. Jack Murphy stood there, his weathered face set in grim lines, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Behind him were several Marines in full dress uniform, their bearing and insignia marking them as senior officers from the Inspector General's office. Staff Sergeant Ethan Blackwood, the lead officer announced formally, you are hereby detained under Article 31 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, suspected of conspiracy, murder, and war crimes in connection with Operation Mirage. As the officers moved into the boathouse securing Blackwood and the contractors, Murphy made his way to Rebecca's side. Lieutenant Westbrook contacted me last night, he explained quietly. Said things were coming to a head. I called in some markers with old friends who still believe the Corps stands for honor, not cover-ups. Rebecca lowered her weapon, feeling the adrenaline beginning to ebb as the situation stabilized. Jenkins' evidence, being secured as we speak, Murphy assured her. A team is already on the way to his cabin to bring him in for formal testimony. This goes all the way to the Pentagon now. No stopping it, no burying it. Westbrook joined them, holstering her weapon. It's over, she said simply. Rebecca looked at Blackwood as he was handcuffed and led away, his cold eyes still locked on her with murderous intent. Not quite, she replied. There's still a village in Iraq that needs justice, medical support for the ongoing effects of those chemicals, recognition of what was done to them. One step at a time, Westbrook counseled, placing a hand on her shoulder. But yes, that's next. Your father would be proud. As the boathouse cleared, leaving just Rebecca, Westbrook, and Murphy, the first full rays of sunrise streamed through the windows, illuminating the space where violence had erupted moments before. Rebecca reached up to touch the dog tags she wore beneath her shirt, her father's original tags, not the special ones he had created for emergencies. He knew this day would come, she said quietly. That's why he trained me the way he did. Not just for self-defense, but for this specific mission. Murphy nodded understanding in his weathered features. Bill always played the long game, even from beyond the grave, it seems. 6 months later, Rebecca Calloway stood before a fresh class of Marine recruits at Parris Island, now wearing the uniform of a hand-to-hand combat instructor. The investigation into Operation Mirage had sent shockwaves through the military establishment, resulting in multiple high-level prosecutions, formal apologies to the Kurdish village, and a comprehensive medical support program for the affected civilians. Blackwood and the surviving conspirators were serving lengthy sentences in military prison. Jenkins had received immunity in exchange for his testimony and was working with international human rights organizations to document similar abuses. Lieutenant Westbrook, now Captain Westbrook, had been commended for her role in exposing the cover-up. And Rebecca had found her place not just as her father's daughter, but as a Marine who embodied the Corps' true values of honor, courage, and commitment. The first lesson you need to learn, she told the wide-eyed recruits before her, is that strength comes in many forms. Some of you are big, some are small, some are fast, some are strong, but all of you have the potential to be warriors if you're willing to put in the work and show respect for your fellow Marines. Behind her, a projection screen showed security footage from the famous 28 seconds that had made her a legend throughout the Corps, the moment during her final evaluation when Blackwood, consumed by desperation as the investigation closed in, had arranged one last attempt to eliminate her under the guise of a special combat demonstration. The footage showed 5 men, including Blackwood, surrounding a single female recruit in the training facility. It showed their coordinated attack designed to appear as a training exercise gone too far, an unfortunate accident that would remove the final witness. And it showed Rebecca Calloway finally revealing her true capabilities, neutralizing all 5 attackers with a precision and efficiency that left the entire facility in stunned silence. 28 seconds that had transformed the Corps' perception of female combat potential forever. The Marine Corps doesn't care what you look like when you walk through those doors. Rebecca continued, her gray eyes so like her father's, scanning the diverse group of faces before her. What matters is who you become when you walk back out. She paused, letting her gaze connect with each recruit individually. And if you remember nothing else from my class, remember this. Never judge a warrior by their size. Judge them by their heart, their skill, and their willingness to stand up for what's right. In the back of the training facility, Jack Murphy watched with quiet pride, his weathered face softened by the knowledge that William Calloway's legacy lived on, not just in the justice finally delivered for Operation Mirage, but in the daughter who had completed his final mission. Rebecca Calloway, the woman they called weak in training until she knocked out 5 Marines in 28 seconds of perfect justice.